Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cosy and history takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're unrolling a mystery made not of thunder or treasure chests or dramatic curses, but of parchment, ink, coastlines, and one very inconvenient question. Because now and then, the past produces an object that doesn't merely seem old, it seems misplaced, as though it has wandered in from a version of history that doesn't quite match the one we thought we knew. This evening's gentle journey is all about a map. Not an especially large one, not one drawn in gold, and not one that changed hands in a candlelit tower while monks gasped in Latin. Though to be fair, that would have been excellent for the atmosphere. No, this is a quieter sort of mystery, which in many ways makes it more unsettling. It is known as the Vinland Map, and for decades it has hovered between revelation and embarrassment, between discovery and deception, like a guest at a dinner party who may either be a forgotten nobleman or a man in an impressively confident fake moustache. Because this map appears to show something that should not, by all ordinary expectations, be there at all. It seems to depict lands across the Atlantic associated with Vinland, the place tied in Norse tradition to voyages westward from Greenland, and possibly a part of North America known in Europe centuries before such knowledge was meant to exist in any formal mapped sense. If genuine, it would suggest that information about western lands travelled farther and lasted longer than many historians once supposed. If false, it would still be remarkable, just in a different and slightly more awkward direction, as one of the most successful and controversial historical deceptions of modern times. And that is where this story becomes so irresistible, because it is not only about whether a map is real, it is about how history decides what counts as real. It is about the gap between what happened and what survived. It's about how easily a line on parchment can pull entire centuries into doubt. And it is about the curious fact that we often imagine the past as settled and orderly, when in truth it is full of loose threads, partial records, confident guesses, and the occasional object that arrives looking as though it knows something it should not. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and perhaps what time it is in your corner of it. There is something fitting, isn't there, about gathering from different places and different hours to think about a map that may have crossed not only oceans but time itself. A medieval-looking document, possibly carrying news from a coastline that Europe was not supposed to have on file. It does make ordinary bedtime concerns feel a little less dramatic. Lost your keys? Unfortunate. Misplaced an entire historical timeline? Considerably worse. If you find this quiet little expedition soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant place to let your mind idle for a while, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm corner of the world find others who enjoy drifting off to old questions, strange documents, and the occasional scholarly argument about ink chemistry, which, admittedly, is a niche mood, but a good one. Now, I do hope this isn't so intriguing that it keeps you awake, but if it does, at least you'll have spent your sleeplessness in the company of medieval maps, Norse voyages, disputed evidence, and historians doing what historians do best, which is disagreeing very seriously over objects that are, in this case, both fragile and deeply inconvenient. So settle in, unclench the day a little, and let's begin with the odd fact that maps are never just maps. We like to think of them as neutral things. A clean arrangement of coastlines, rivers, mountains and borders. A practical device, a guide, something that tells you where you are and where everything else is in relation to that. But historically, maps have always been more than that. They are arguments in visual form. They are statements about what is known, what matters, what is imagined, and what is worth putting on the page. A map can record knowledge, certainly, but it can also preserve rumour, ambition, fear, theology, guesswork, and wishful thinking. Medieval maps, especially, were not always trying to do the same job as modern ones. They were often less concerned with perfect geographic precision than with meaning, hierarchy, and worldview. Jerusalem might sit at the centre. Paradise might appear at the edge. Monsters might occupy distant waters, not necessarily because anyone had conducted a rigorous zoological survey of sea serpents, but because the unknown has always had a way of attracting dramatic illustrations. And so, to understand why the Vinland Map caused such a stir, it helps to remember that old maps live at the intersection of information and imagination. They are not photographs, they are interpretations. Even when made carefully, they compress the world through the limits of their age. Travel was slower, reports were second-hand, distances were hard to measure, coastlines were often inferred from sailors' descriptions, copied from earlier manuscripts, or redrawn through chains of transmission where one person misread another and the next person copied the mistake with great confidence and beautiful penmanship. That alone would make any unusual medieval map interesting. But the Vinland Map was unusual in a very specific way. It seemed to place, on a document associated with the 15th century, a landmass in the Western Atlantic labelled in relation to Vinland. Not just a vague island, not just a floating rumour of land, but a shape and label suggestive enough to provoke the obvious question: how could this be there? How could a map apparently from before Columbus carry what looked like geographic awareness connected to lands far to the west? Now, of course, the name Vinland itself did not emerge from nowhere. Long before modern debates over this map, scholars already knew from Icelandic sagas and Norse tradition that seafarers from Greenland had voyaged westward around the year 1000. Leif Erikson and others had entered the historical imagination as figures standing at the edges of European expansion, long before the more institutionally celebrated voyages of Columbus. By the 20th century, and especially after archaeological confirmation of Norse presence at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, it became clear that Norse exploration of North America was not fantasy at all. The question was never simply whether Norse sailors reached the Western Atlantic. They did. The more difficult question was whether that knowledge travelled back into broader European awareness in a way that endured, circulated, and found its way into learned traditions, including maps. A voyage can happen without reshaping continental knowledge. Sailors can see a shore without that shoreline entering the standard mental picture of the world. Information can be discovered, told, forgotten, preserved in fragments, or confined to small circles. History is full of things known once and lost again. Entire techniques vanish. Cities disappear from memory. Trade routes collapse. Manuscripts are copied for a while and then not at all. Knowledge is not a straight staircase. It flickers. And this is where the Vinland Map became such an electrifying object, because it seemed to hint not just at Norse exploration itself, but at the survival of that knowledge into a later documentary tradition. If authentic, it might suggest that somewhere between the Norse voyages and the great maritime expansions of late medieval and early modern Europe, there existed channels of information that have only partially survived. Not necessarily a grand secret kept by cloaked map makers in underground libraries, which is frankly more opera than history, but perhaps a quieter chain of transmission. A text copied here, a report preserved there, a geographic note folded into some learned context and then nearly lost. Yet from the very beginning, the map inspired not only fascination but suspicion. And perhaps that was inevitable. History can forgive many things, but it becomes deeply cautious when an object arrives, bearing exactly the sort of evidence people have long wondered about, especially if that evidence seems almost too neatly placed to reopen an old debate. Scholars are not wrong to be wary of documents that appear to answer famous questions in just the right way. There is a reason that sensational discoveries are often treated less like honoured guests and more like strangers showing up in a borrowed coat claiming to be everyone's cousin. Part of the trouble is that forgery has always followed value. Whenever an object can confer prestige, rewrite a story, enrich a collection, or make a scholarly reputation, someone somewhere becomes tempted to help history along. Not always with obvious malice either. Some forgers are motivated by money, some by ego, some by ideology, some by the peculiar delight of outwitting experts, and some perhaps most dangerous of all, are motivated by the belief that they are merely restoring what ought to be true, which is rarely an excellent basis for documentary integrity. That is why old objects are judged not only by appearance or even by provenance, but by a whole web of evidence. The material must be examined. The ink, the parchment, the writing style, the language, the context in which the object surfaced, the company it keeps, the assumptions behind its claims. One does not simply look at a potentially world-altering map and say, yes, seems old enough, lovely coastline, let us all reorganise our understanding of European exploration. At least one should not. Academia has its flaws, but it does usually require a little more paperwork than that. Still, the excitement was understandable. The very possibility of such a map touches something deep in the historical imagination. We are drawn to evidence that suggests the world was larger, stranger, and more connected than simple textbook timelines imply. There is a reason people remain fascinated by stories of ancient voyages, lost travellers, forgotten intermediaries, and documents that seem to arrive carrying untidy news from the margins. A map that hints Europe may have known of Western lands before, it was supposed to sound less like stationery and more like narrative dynamite. And yet the real power of the Vinland Map lies not only in what it might prove, but in how it forces us to think about evidence itself. Because most people do not encounter the past directly. We inherit it through layers, through artifacts, texts, translations, restorations, catalogues, photographs, scholarly arguments, museum labels, and sometimes very assertive documentaries. Each layer involves interpretation. Each interpretation carries assumptions. Even deciding what counts as a puzzle is a choice shaped by the questions of a given age. For centuries, European exploration was told in a strongly organised way. There were heroes, turning points, official discoveries, and neat symbolic thresholds. Then historians began, more and more, to complicate that picture. Indigenous knowledge had always preceded European arrival, of course. Norse voyages had to be acknowledged. Islamic, Asian, African and Arctic navigational worlds forced broader comparison. Old ideas about who knew what and when began to soften at the edges. The story became less like a clean line and more like a tangle of intersecting routes, partial contacts, and uneven remembrance. In that changing context, the Vinland Map was irresistible because it seemed to sit exactly where those older narratives were weakest. If it were genuine, it would not simply add a detail. It would expose a hole. It would imply that something important was once known, then faded, then reappeared centuries later in altered form. History does not like holes of that kind, though in truth it is full of them. The archive is not complete. It never was. What survives is not a perfect sample of what existed. Fires happen, wars happen, monasteries dissolve, books rot, marginal notes vanish, and sometimes the most consequential information lives only briefly before sinking beneath the record. That alone is enough to make anyone pause before dismissing the possibility outright. Because lost knowledge is not a fantasy. It is a normal feature of the human story. We lose songs, routes, recipes, names, diagrams, measurements, calendars, and entire local understandings of landscape with astonishing regularity. Even in the modern world, with backups and databases and enough duplicate photographs of lunches to overwhelm future archaeologists, we still misplace things constantly. Medieval Europe, for all its learning, was not an ideal environment for perfect preservation. But then again, the fact that something could have happened does not mean a specific document is the evidence for it. That is the balancing act at the heart of this mystery. It is perfectly possible that Norse exploration reached North America and that some awareness of Western lands drifted into parts of Europe. That does not automatically validate any single map claiming to reflect such knowledge. Likewise, proving a map false does not erase the broader history of Norse presence in the Western Atlantic. These are different questions. though they often become tangled together because people understandably want one tidy answer to do all the work. There is also something wonderfully human in the way we react to disputed objects. We tend to sort ourselves into camps rather quickly. Believer or skeptic, genuine or fake, lost truth or clever fraud. But the actual work of understanding often happens in a more irritating middle space, where evidence accumulates slowly, interpretations shift, and certainty refuses to settle down. Scholars compare handwriting, chemists test pigments, conservators inspect fibres, historians chase provenance trails that go cold in one century and reappear in another wearing a different name. It is, in its own quiet way, a detective story, though one with more footnotes and rather fewer rooftop chases. And perhaps that is why the Vinland Map remains so compelling, even for people who do not normally spend their evenings thinking about parchment analysis. It offers not just a puzzle, but a lens on how we build historical confidence. What kind of proof do we accept? How much weight do we give to material science versus stylistic judgment? What happens when one kind of evidence points one way and another points somewhere else? How do reputations, institutions, and expectations shape the reception of a find? At what point does skepticism become healthy caution, and at what point does it become resistance to inconvenient possibilities? None of these questions has the quick neatness of a bedtime fairy tale, though they do have the advantage of being true to life. Real history rarely unfolds as a single dramatic reveal. It is more like staring at a dim landscape while your eyes slowly adjust. A little more comes into view, then something you thought was a tree turns out to be a gatepost, and another thing that looks certain in daylight becomes much less so in the mist. The Vinland Map lives in exactly that sort of half-light. It has been welcomed, doubted, defended, attacked, tested, retested and debated across decades. It has invited confidence and caution in nearly equal measure. Some have seen in it the survival of astonishing early knowledge. Others have seen one of the most sophisticated historical forgeries ever to gain traction. Still others have treated it as a lesson in the dangers of wanting the past to surprise us in precisely the way we hoped it would. And yet even before the laboratory arguments, before the scholarly papers and counter-arguments and microscopic examinations, there is something almost inherently provocative about the image itself. A medieval-looking map with a western land where the ordinary chronology says there should be none. A suggestion, however disputed, that the mapmakers of Europe may have had whispers of shores beyond the Atlantic, long before those shores entered the official centre of European history. One can see why the object refused to stay quiet, because maps do not just show space, they reveal horizons. They tell us what a culture thought lay beyond the edge and what it believed was worth bringing into the field of knowledge. To place a western land on such a page is to redraw not only geography but expectation. It raises the possibility that Europe's mental world was, at least in some corners, wider than later narratives allowed. Or alternatively, that a modern hand understood those narratives well enough to manufacture exactly the right disturbance. Either way, we are left with an object that behaves like a threshold. Step toward it, and you find yourself asking not just where the lines lead, but who drew them, when, with what materials, from what sources and under what assumptions. You begin with a map and end up in a much larger argument about exploration, memory, evidence, and the uneasy relationship between discovery and belief. So before we can weigh the ink or question the parchment or compare styles and coastlines, it helps to linger for a moment with the central discomfort that gave this map its power in the first place. It appears to offer knowledge that should not, by ordinary expectations, be there, and whether that means history is missing a piece, or whether someone later inserted one, is what makes the story so difficult to let go of. Because somewhere in that tension between lost knowledge and clever invention lies the reason the Vinland Map continues to trouble the tidy borders of the past, and the next step is to look at how this strange document entered the modern world at all, carrying its quiet storm with it. And that is where the map begins to behave less like an old document, and more like a visitor who has arrived without proper introductions. because before anyone could argue over whether its coastlines were miraculous or mischievous, the first mystery was simpler and in some ways more troubling. Where had this thing actually come from? Not in the grand medieval sense, though that mattered too, but in the painfully practical sense historians care about very much indeed. Who had it? When? How did it surface? And why did it seem to step into the modern world carrying both extraordinary claims and a remarkably untidy backstory? The Vinland Map first entered the record in 1957, when it was offered to the British Museum through the London book trade on behalf of a dealer named Enzo Ferraioli di Ruggi. That first encounter already tells you quite a lot about the tone of what followed, because the British Museum did not greet it with immediate scholarly delight and celebratory tea. It declined the sale, and suspicion appears to have been present from the beginning. This was not a case of a document spending decades wrapped in unanimous reverence before anyone thought to raise an eyebrow. The eyebrows were there early, and they were working overtime. Now, that alone does not prove anything. Institutions pass on real things all the time. Experts can be cautious, distracted, mistaken, or simply unconvinced by an object's presentation. Still, provenance matters, and the Vinland Map did not emerge with the sort of quiet, well-documented lineage that lets curators sleep peacefully. Instead, it appeared in the orbit of dealers, partial explanations, and missing certainty. In the late 1950s, it moved into the hands of the American rare book dealer Lawrence C. Whitten, who bought it for a relatively modest sum compared with the reputation it would later acquire. Whitten then tried to interest Yale in it. Yale hesitated at first, which in retrospect feels rather sensible, though the story did not end there. Eventually, the wealthy Yale alumnus Paul Mellon financed the purchase, and the map made its way into the university's world, where its fate would become inseparable from the institution that housed it. But even that description makes the arrival sound neater than it really was. The map was not simply a lone parchment laid dramatically on a table for experts to admire. It was associated with other medieval materials, and this association became central to its credibility. When it surfaced, it was bound with a manuscript known as the Tartar Relation, a text concerning a 13th century Franciscan mission to the Mongols. Later, Yale acquired part of a genuine medieval manuscript of Vincent of Beauvai's Speculum Historiale, and matching wormholes indicated that the map had likely once been physically linked to that volume as well. This mattered enormously because authentic company can lend comfort. If an alarming newcomer appears standing between two respectable medieval texts, people naturally wonder whether it belongs there after all. Objects, much like dinner guests, are often judged by the table at which they are found. That physical association gave the map a kind of borrowed gravity. Radiocarbon dating and codicological work later supported the medieval age of the parchment and associated manuscript materials, placing them roughly in the 15th century. And that fact, though important, also added one of the great complications of the entire affair. The parchment could be old, while the drawing on it could be newer. A forger, if one was involved, didn't necessarily need to manufacture medieval skin from scratch, like some sort of deeply overcommitted alchemist. An old blank or repurposed sheet from a genuine manuscript could do the trick rather nicely. The map's supporters and critics would spend decades circling that uncomfortable possibility. For now, in the years when the map was first being assessed, what mattered was that it appeared materially entangled with authentic medieval manuscripts, and that made it much harder to dismiss at a glance. There was also another ingredient in the recipe, and this one was less chemical than cultural. The map entered public life at exactly the sort of moment when a document like this could ignite not only scholarly curiosity but wider historical appetite. By the middle of the 20th century, interest in Norse exploration of North America had already been simmering for decades. Leif Erikson had become, in certain circles, more than a medieval voyager. He had become part of a modern argument about who ought to stand at the symbolic beginning of European America. Was it Columbus, attached to older national narratives, imperial commemoration, and familiar textbook ceremony? Or was it the Norse, whose voyages seemed older, harder, northern, and in some tellings more appealing to groups eager to shift the story westward and backward? The Vinland Map arrived in that atmosphere like a document that knew exactly which room to enter. Yale's public unveiling in 1965 only amplified that effect. The university announced the map's existence with considerable excitement and paired the revelation with a scholarly volume, The Vinland Map and the Tartar Relation, prepared by Yale and British Museum scholars. The timing was especially theatrical, whether intentionally or not. The announcement landed just before Columbus Day, so the map did not simply appear as an obscure, curatorial matter for specialists in manuscript studies. It burst onto the scene as a challenge to a familiar historical icon. If genuine, it seemed to offer medieval cartographic evidence that lands connected with North America were known in Europe before Columbus sailed in 1492, and because public history loves a dramatic reversal, headlines and imaginations did what they always do when handed a good controversy. They ran with it. To understand why the reaction was so intense, it helps to picture what the map appeared to promise. It seemed to be a 15th century world map, modest in appearance but extraordinary in implication, showing a land labelled Vinlanda Insula to the southwest of Greenland. That label was the spark. Plenty of old maps contain strange islands and uncertain coasts. Medieval cartography is not exactly free from enthusiastic geography. But a labelled Vinland, presented in a context suggesting pre-Columbian European knowledge of Western lands, was something else. It hinted not merely that the Norse had reached North America, which saga readers already suspected and archaeologists would later support, but that knowledge of those voyages had entered a learned mapping tradition and survived into broader European awareness. That was a much bigger claim. A voyage is one thing. A place on a map is another. Yet almost as soon as the applause began, the objections arrived. Some medievalists and historians of cartography were uneasy from the moment photographs circulated. The map's lines, lettering, and geographical choices did not sit comfortably with all specialists. Questions were asked about its style, its relation to known medieval map traditions, and perhaps most awkwardly of all, its provenance. Where exactly had it been before 1957? Why was the chain of custody so cloudy? Why did a document of such apparent importance emerge through a route so entangled with dealers, rather than from a clear and well-documented institutional archive? Sensational artifacts do not become less suspicious when their biography rears like a filing cabinet after a strong wind. And then there was Ferrajoli. The dealer on whose behalf the map had originally been offered was later linked publicly to manuscript theft, including material from Zaragoza Cathedral. That fact did not by itself prove the map was forged, but it did darken the air around it considerably. Later research by John Paul Floyd and others connected the accompanying manuscripts to Zaragoza Cathedral Library, and one 19th century exhibition catalogue described a codex containing the Speculum Historiale and the Tartar Relation, there before the map surfaced in the 20th century trade. Significantly though, that earlier description made no mention of any map. That silence became one of the many little absences that matter in provenance work. Sometimes history speaks loudly through what it includes. Sometimes it mutters through what it leaves out. It is worth pausing there, because this is one of the reasons the Vinland Map has remained so captivating, even after major scientific findings moved the consensus strongly against it. The object did not emerge as an obvious fake with theatrical errors and convenient fresh ink still drying in the corners. It emerged by attaching itself to authentic medieval matter and to a genuinely fascinating historical possibility. That combination gave it staying power. It did not ask scholars to believe in dragons on the moon. It asked them to consider whether some knowledge of Norse Western voyages had survived longer than expected. Since that idea was plausible in principle, the map was able to lodge itself in the narrow and maddening space where a document can seem both suspicious and tantalizing at once. The irony, of course, is that the 20th century turned out to be an almost perfect time for such an artefact to make a bid for fame. In 1960, not long after the map's first appearance in the trade, archaeologists began uncovering the Norse site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, later confirming that Norse people had indeed reached North America around the turn of the first millennium. That archaeological reality changed the background of the debate. It meant that the map's claim was no longer measured against complete implausibility. The Norse crossing of the Atlantic was real. The question became whether the specific cartographic witness called the Vinland Map was also real, or whether it was parasitic on a true story, borrowing legitimacy from an authentic chapter of exploration, while fabricating its own place in the record. In forgery studies, that is often the clever move. Do not invent the impossible, merely counterfeit the missing evidence for something half believed already. And so the map acquired a strange double life. To the public, it could appear as a thrilling revision to the familiar discovery narrative. To scholars, it became an argument in object form. The excitement around it was never only about geography. It was also about prestige, institutions, and the irresistible possibility of being associated with a major historical correction. If genuine, Yale possessed one of the most consequential cartographic survivals in the Western canon. If not, then Yale had become custodian of a costly and embarrassing impostor. Universities, like everyone else, prefer the first option. That does not mean bad faith. It means that people are human, and humans are noticeably more cheerful when a treasure turns out to be a treasure. The map's physical look also helped it. It was not lavishly decorated in the way some medieval showpieces are. It lacked the heavy ornamentation that might have made it feel flamboyant or theatrical. It looked, in a sense, sober enough to pass. Faded ink, patched wormholes, practical lines, a somewhat workmanlike character. Not the sort of document one immediately imagines as a glamorous forgery designed for dramatic reveal. Its modesty was part of its persuasiveness. A fake can fail by trying too hard. The Vinland Map, at least in its presentation, understood restraint. If it was a forgery, it was not the sort that burst into the room wearing peacock feathers and shouting about destiny. It wore medieval understatement and let the label Vinlanda Insula do the shocking part quietly. Still, awkward facts kept surfacing. The map's story was full of what historians sometimes call friction points, those little features that refuse to settle comfortably into a smooth narrative. The British Museum's initial reluctance, the secrecy around acquisition, the murky route through the trade, the link to a dealer with a troubling background, the incomplete earlier record. The way the map seemed to answer a famous historical question a little too elegantly. None of these alone delivered a verdict, but together they made the object feel unstable, as though it had not simply come from the past but from several paths at once. One was the medieval world it claimed to represent. Another was the 20th century world that suddenly wanted very much to believe, or disbelieve, what it said. This is what I mean by a map arriving out of time. It was supposedly a 15th century witness, yet it entered modern consciousness carrying the arguments of the 20th century on its back. It touched questions of national pride, discovery myths, religion, ethnicity, institutional prestige, and the public hunger for historical upsets. It looked backward, but it landed in a very modern battle over who gets to stand at the beginning of a story. That is one reason the map became larger than itself. People were not only examining parchment, they were wrestling over symbolic firsts, historical inheritance, and the uncomfortable fact that origin stories are rarely just about origins. They are about ownership of meaning in the present. By the time later scientific work would test the map's ink more decisively, the object had already lived several lives. It had been proposed as a revelation, challenged as a fraud, defended with care, doubted with relish, and folded into public culture as one of those historical mysteries that refused to remain politely in the reading room. Yale's 2021 analysis, using modern techniques across the whole document, concluded that the ink is pervaded by titanium compounds, associated with 20th century manufacture, and that an inscription on the back had been altered in a modern ink to make the map appear more convincingly tied to the medieval speculum manuscript. Yale's own curator declared there was no reasonable doubt that the map is a fake, and yet even this apparent closing of the case did not erase the fascination of how it first arrived and why so many intelligent people wrestled with it for so long. Because the Vinland Map was never only a technical problem, it was, and in a sense still is, a story about the difficulty of judging objects that stand exactly where possibility and desire overlap. A genuine medieval parchment carrying a modern deception is, in its own way, more interesting than a simple counterfeit on fresh paper. It tells us about opportunity, about the afterlives of manuscripts, about how the material past can be repurposed to manufacture a different past altogether. The map may not be the witness it pretended to be, but it remains a witness of another kind, to the ambitions of forgers, the vulnerabilities of institutions, and the deep cultural charge attached to the idea of who knew America first. So by the time scholars looked more closely at the map's western label, and that unsettling little landmass beyond Greenland, the object had already done something remarkable. It had forced historians to confront not just a possible medieval surprise, but the machinery by which modern history authenticates, doubts, desires, and sometimes deceives itself. It had arrived from nowhere respectable, attached itself to genuine companions, found a home in one of the world's great libraries, and then sat there for decades while chemistry, codicology, cartography, and human hope took turns explaining it. That is quite an accomplishment for a single sheet of parchment, even if one suspects it has been lying from the start. And since the name that made it famous was not Columbus or Greenland but Vinland, the next thing to understand is why that word had such power in the first place, and how a place half known through Norse memory came to hover at the very edge of Europe's imagined world. Long before Columbus became the name most schoolbooks pinned to the Atlantic crossing, there was already another western place drifting through the memory of the North. Not a continent in the modern sense, not a fully measured coastline with latitude lines and reliable harbours, but a place with a name: Vinland. That name mattered because it meant the idea of land beyond Greenland was not invented after 1492. It already existed in the medieval world, though in a very different form. Half report, half remembered voyage, carried in Norse tradition long before it ever became part of wider European arguments about who got where first. This is one of the first things worth clearing gently from the table, because discovery stories have a habit of becoming too tidy. Columbus was not the first human being to reach the Americas, which indigenous peoples had known, inhabited, named, shaped, and understood for millennia. Nor was he the first European known to have reached North America. The Norse were there centuries earlier, and the archaeological remains at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland are the clearest accepted evidence of that. UNESCO describes the site as the remains of an 11th century Viking settlement, and a 2021 scientific study dated Norse woodworking activity there to AD 1021. And yet Columbus still occupies that oversized symbolic chair in popular history because his voyages led to sustained, transformative, and devastating entanglements between Europe and the Americas on a scale the Norse expeditions did not. That distinction matters. Reaching a place is one thing. Permanently redirecting the course of continents is another. But it also means that when we talk about Vinland before Columbus, we're really talking about a different kind of knowledge, smaller in scale, more fragile in transmission, and far less secure in the written record. It was not the knowledge of empire yet. It was the knowledge of sailors, settlers on the margin, and later storytellers trying to hold on to fragments of what lay beyond the Western Sea. To see how Vinland entered memory at all, you have to start with the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. By the late 9th century, Norse settlers had established themselves in Iceland, and by the late 10th century they had moved farther west to Greenland. From there, the leap to land still farther west was not impossible in the way a transoceanic jump from Iberia might sound in the abstract. This was not one dramatic plunge into the complete unknown from Europe's main centres. It was more like a chain of stepping stones across a very cold and increasingly inconvenient sea. Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to lands beyond. Difficult, yes, but within the operating range of a maritime culture that knew how to survive in rough northern waters and had good reason to seek timber and other resources scarce in Greenland. The most detailed literary accounts of these westward ventures survive in two Icelandic sagas, Grenlandinga saga, usually called the Saga of the Greenlanders, and Eric's saga Rauda, Eric the Red's saga. These texts were written down centuries after the events they describe, and they do not agree in every detail, which is part of what makes them both valuable and troublesome. They preserve names, routes, motives, and episodes connected with voyages west of Greenland, but they are not stenographic transcripts from the year 1000. They are literary works shaped by oral tradition, memory, storytelling habits, and the concerns of the centuries in which they were recorded. Historians treat them seriously, but not naively, which is a good rule in general, and especially useful whenever a text contains both practical sailing details and the occasional narrative flourish that sounds as though someone in the family line may have improved the story slightly after supper. Even so, the broad outline is striking. In one saga, Bjarni Herjolfsson is blown off course while sailing toward Greenland and sights lands to the west around 985, though he does not go ashore. Later, Leif Erikson buys his ship and explores more deliberately, encountering lands that the tradition names Helluland, Markland and Vinland. Helluland is often associated with a stony northern coast, Markland with forested country, and Vinland with a milder and more inviting region farther south. The other saga arranges the voyages somewhat differently, but it too preserves the essential point. Norse seafarers from Greenland reached lands west of Greenland and attached names to them. That sequence of names is one reason Vinland is so fascinating. It suggests not a single accidental landfall, but a zone of western places distinguished by their character and remembered by labels. Helluland, the land of flat stones; Markland, the forest land; Vinland, the place with the disputed name that has launched 1,000 scholarly footnotes and at least several people into premature certainty. For a long time, the standard interpretation treated Vinland as wine land or land of vines, supported by medieval explanations that linked it to self-growing grapevines. But some scholars have argued that the name may instead reflect Old Norse vin in the sense of meadow or pasture. That alternative matters because grapes push the imagined location farther south, while pasture or meadow sits more comfortably with Newfoundland. The argument has not disappeared, and the name remains one of those pleasingly stubborn details that refuse to let everyone relax. The archaeological evidence makes the picture both firmer and more complicated. Lansor Meadows is the only undisputed Norse site in North America outside Greenland, and the site shows turf-walled buildings, ironworking and unmistakably Norse material culture. The 2021 tree ring dating study fixed Norse activity there to AD 1021, which gives historians something wonderfully rare in early medieval transatlantic history: an exact year. But Lansor Meadows may not itself be the full Vinland of the sagas. Archaeologists and Parks Canada have long suggested that it functioned as a base camp or gateway for exploration farther south, and finds such as butternuts at the site imply voyages into regions where those trees grew, likely somewhere farther down the Gulf of St. Lawrence or nearby mainland areas. In other words, the one confirmed Norse site in North America may be only the northern foothold of a wider pattern of movement. That helps explain why Vinland before Columbus was both real and elusive. Real, because Norse voyagers almost certainly did reach western lands and preserve memory of them. Elusive, because what exactly Vinland named may have shifted depending on context. It may have referred to a particular camp, a broader region, or in some retellings a category of more southerly land beyond Greenland. Modern readers often want one neat dot on a map. Medieval memory is not always so cooperative. People can remember the existence of a place and still disagree about its exact boundaries, especially when the place lies across a difficult ocean, is visited only sporadically and never becomes a fully integrated colony in the long term. Another important point is that Vinland was not entirely unknown outside the sagas. The earliest widely acknowledged surviving written mention in continental Europe appears in the work of Adam of Bremen around 1075. Writing on the authority of King Sweyn II of Denmark, Adam referred to Vinland as an island discovered in the Northern Ocean and associated it with naturally growing vines. That brief mention is enormously significant. It shows that information, however garbled or simplified, about Western lands had travelled beyond Greenlandic and Icelandic circles into a broader Latin Christian text. Vinland, then, was not just a local fireside rumour trapped forever at the edge of the Norse world. It had entered literature on the continent, though in a form too fragmentary to reorganise European geography. And that is where the phrase, "before Columbus," becomes more interesting than it first appears. If by it we mean, did some Europeans know of lands west of Greenland before 1492, then yes, clearly some did. The Norse did, Greenlanders did, Icelandic traditions remembered it, and Adam of Bremen's text shows that continental learned circles heard at least something of it. But if by it we mean, did Europe in a broad, practical, cartographic and politically mobilised sense possess working knowledge of North America before Columbus, the answer is far more limited. Vinland before Columbus was not mainstream geographical certainty. It was scattered awareness. It was knowledge that existed but did not conquer the map. There are sensible reasons for that. The Norse ventures west did not produce a durable colony like Iceland or the Greenland settlements. Lonso Meadows appears to have been relatively short-lived. These sagas describe tensions and violent encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelingar, and whatever the exact course of events, the Western expeditions did not settle into a stable transatlantic system of exchange on a lasting scale. Greenland itself remained marginal and eventually declined. When the outpost that knows something is remote, vulnerable, and ultimately fading, its knowledge does not always travel far or survive intact. History is full of information stranded at the edges. There is also the issue of medieval worldview. Europe before Columbus did not lack imagination, but it often filtered new reports through inherited authorities and familiar cosmologies. Even when Vinland was known by name, it didn't automatically become the beginning of a new continent in European thought. Medieval geography was a layered mixture of classical learning, biblical history, travel law, and practical experience, and new information did not always force instant revision. Sometimes it sat awkwardly at the margins. Sometimes it was absorbed into older categories. Sometimes it lingered as a curious report without generating the kind of sustained institutional interest needed to redraw the world. A single mention in a chronicle is not the same thing as a navigational revolution. That helps explain why Vinland could be simultaneously known and nearly lost. The sagas were eventually written down in Iceland, preserving memories that would otherwise have vanished entirely. Yet they were recorded in the 13th century, long after the voyages themselves, and their survival was contingent on manuscript culture, copying, and later scholarly attention. Parks Canada notes that the sagas were told orally for years before being written down, with the earliest written versions dating back to the 12th century. That kind of transmission can preserve a surprising amount, but it also allows variation, compression, and narrative shaping. The result is not falsehood, but layered truth. Enough detail to point toward history, enough uncertainty to keep historians busy for generations, which is in fairness what historians tend to call a very good week. Once Lonso Meadows was found in the 1960s, the sagas were transformed from controversial literary witnesses into texts with archaeological support. That did not make every episode literal or every route certain, but it changed the balance decisively. What had once been treated by some as heroic legend or nationalist enthusiasm now had turf walls, iron slag, and datable wood behind it. The Norse had indeed crossed the Atlantic and worked timber in Newfoundland around AD 1021. So when we say Vinland existed before Columbus, we're not speaking only about stories. We're speaking about a remembered Western world grounded in actual voyages. Still, there is a subtle trap here, and it is worth avoiding. Modern readers can be tempted to take the existence of Norse contact and inflate it into a hidden medieval awareness of America waiting just off stage. The evidence does not really support that larger fantasy. There is no sign that 15th century Europe broadly operated with a clear understanding of North America derived from the Norse. Vinland left traces, but not a sustained cartographic tradition that everyone somehow ignored. What survived was partial, unstable, and often disconnected from the practical currents that later drove Iberian Atlantic expansion. So Vinland before Columbus was not a suppressed global fact hidden in a drawer. It was more like a fading northern memory that survived in specific texts and traditions without reshaping Europe as a whole. That is precisely why the Vinland Map, centuries later, caused such excitement. It seemed to promise the missing bridge. Not just Norse voyaging, which we now know happened, but the persistence of that knowledge into late medieval learned cartography. It seemed to say that Vinland was not merely remembered in the north. It was placed on a map in a broader intellectual world before Columbus. If true, that would shrink the gap between the Norse voyages and the age of Atlantic Empire. It would suggest not a forgotten whisper, but an actual documentary survival of Western awareness. No wonder people wanted to believe it. It offered continuity where the ordinary record gives us breaks. Yet perhaps the more interesting historical truth is that Vinland did not need that map to exist. It was already there, before Columbus, in the difficult surviving record of the North, in saga tradition, in Adam of Bremen, in the archaeology of Newfoundland, in the butternuts that imply voyages farther south than the one excavated Norse station, in the very fact that Europeans at the edge of the North Atlantic had reached a western shore and named parts of it. The map controversy matters because it concerns transmission and evidence. But the deeper story begins earlier and stands even without it. Vinland was real enough to leave traces, and faint enough that later centuries could doubt, forget, rediscover, and argue over what those traces meant. There is something almost inevitable about that pattern. Frontier knowledge is often like this. People at the edge know something first. They give it names. They tell stories about it. Those stories travel inward unevenly, becoming rumour in one place, text in another, silence somewhere else. Then centuries later, when the centre finally arrives and declares discovery, the older edge knowledge looks awkwardly ahead of its time. Not because it was imaginary, but because it was never integrated into the dominant version of events. Vinland belongs to that category. It was a real Western place in Norse consciousness, yet not one that medieval Europe at large successfully absorbed into a New World picture. And that may be the most honest way to understand Vinland before Columbus, not as a secret America fully known and scandalously hidden, and not as a mere myth dissolved by modern skepticism, but as a partial contact zone between memory and geography, a place reached by Norse seafarers named in the north, mentioned on the continent, then left hanging at the edge of medieval understanding. Known, but not enough. Remembered, but not securely enough. Real, but without the institutional momentum to become the centre of the map. Which is why, before anyone ever argued about whether a 15th century document had drawn it too early, there was already a more basic and more compelling story waiting there. The Norse themselves, moving west from Greenland into waters where Europe thinned out and the known world began to fray. By the time the Norse pushed west beyond Iceland and into Greenland, they were not sailing into a blank page. They were moving along the ragged edge of a world they understood well enough to survive, but not so well that it ever became comfortable. That distinction matters. We often imagine long-distance voyages as bold, clean gestures on an empty map, one ship leaving one shore for another. In reality, the North Atlantic was less like a highway, and more like a chain of difficult thresholds. Each crossing demanded judgment, memory, weather sense, and ships built for a sea that had very little interest in helping anyone. The Norse did not conquer that ocean by magic, and they certainly did not do it because the North Atlantic had a generous personality. They did it because they had become exceptionally skilled at living with cold water, unreliable skies, and coastlines that could either save you or ruin you, depending on how well you read them. The route west was built in stages. Norse settlement in Iceland had already shown that Scandinavian communities could adapt to isolated islands and organise seaborne migration across open water. Greenland came next, not as a romantic act of pure discovery, but as part of this wider North Atlantic expansion. According to the standard historical timeline, Eric the Red settled Greenland in the 980s after exile from Iceland, and in 986 an expedition helped establish the two main Norse settlements there, later known as the Eastern and Western settlements. These were not tiny camps pitched for a season and forgotten. They became the westernmost outposts of Norse society, with farms, churches, trade links, and a bishopric established in 1126. For centuries, Greenland was not a rumour. It was a hard, real extension of medieval Scandinavian life. That said, Greenland was never easy. The National Museum of Denmark notes that the Norse settlements there were not self-sufficient and had to import essentials like iron and timber for construction. In exchange, they exported products such as hides, rope, and especially walrus tusks. That detail helps explain why the Western voyages mattered so much. Timber was scarce in Greenland, and timber is not one of those resources you can politely do without when you depend on boats, buildings, tools, and repairs. A society perched on the Arctic fringe could survive many inconveniences, but a chronic shortage of good wood was a particularly annoying one. So when the sagas speak of lands farther west rich in forest and natural resources, that is not just colourful storytelling. It aligns with the practical needs of people living in Greenland's narrow ecological margins. The vessels that carried the Norse across those waters were also part of the answer. Royal Museums Greenwich notes that Viking ships came in different forms, including longships and wider cargo vessels, all built from overlapping planks, sealed carefully, and designed with shallow drafts that made them useful in coastal and shallower waters. They were moved by oars or by a large square sail, with a steering oar mounted at the stern. This combination gave Norse mariners a rare flexibility. They could cross open sea, but they could also slip into rivers, beach on shorelines, and work close to land when conditions turned unpleasant. It is tempting to think only of dramatic longships with carved prows, but the westward movement depended just as much on practical ships that could carry people, tools, animals, goods, and all the awkward necessities of keeping life going far from home. As for how they found their way, caution is useful. Modern culture sometimes likes to hand the Vikings a box of magical navigation gadgets and declare the problem solved. The reality is less cinematic and more impressive. They almost certainly relied on a combination of experience, observation of the sun and stars, knowledge of currents and winds, coastal recognition, and accumulated sailing traditions. Parks. Canada's interpretation of L'Anse aux Meadows emphasises the viewscape of the Strait of Belle Isle, offshore islands, and the Labrador coast as landmarks aiding Norse navigation. In other words, these sailors were not wandering blindly over abstract ocean. They were reading a marine landscape, sometimes far from land, but very often in relation to remembered bearings, known seasonal conditions, and the shared seamanship of a culture that had spent generations learning how not to die in northern waters. Which is, to be fair, one of the more practical branches of knowledge. Once Greenland had become part of the Norse world, the next step west was no longer unthinkable. It remained dangerous, but it had a logic. The sagas, as Parks Canada summarises, preserve the stories of Eric the Red, Bjarni Herjolfsson, Leif Erikson, and Thorfinn Karlsefni, all tied in one way or another to voyages beyond Greenland. These accounts were first carried orally and only later written down, with the earliest written versions dating back to the 12th century and the fuller saga texts emerging later. That means they are not contemporary logbooks, but neither are they pure fantasy detached from real experience. They preserve what looks very much like cultural memory of actual Western expeditions, even if the details have been shaped and retold through generations. The Norse at the edge of the known sea did not leave us neat reports stamped and archived. They left stories that still carry the weather of their world. Those stories describe more than one Western land. They speak of places later called Helluland, Markland and Vinland, suggesting not just a single accidental landing but a sequence of recognisable regions. The names themselves imply different environments: stony country, forested land, and a more favourable territory farther south. Even if historians debate the exact geographic matching, the pattern is revealing. It suggests repeated observation rather than one confused episode. And when Parks Canada describes Leif's camp in the saga tradition as a place with meadows, forests, salmon and valuable timber, and notes that later expeditions used the same base while gathering lumber, pelts and other goods, the Western world begins to look less like a mythic paradise and more like a zone of resource exploration. A dangerous zone, yes, but also an economically tempting one. Archaeology sharpens that picture. UNESCO describes Lons aux Meadows as the excavated remains of a complete 11th century Viking settlement at the tip of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula, with 8 timber-framed turf structures built in the same style as those in Norse Greenland and Iceland. Nature's 2022 study went further, providing evidence that Norse activity there occurred in AD 1021 by using the atmospheric radiocarbon spike from AD 993 preserved in tree rings. Parks Canada's management plan calls the site the only authenticated Norse archaeological site in the Americas, and interprets it as a base camp and gateway for explorations into Vinland. That is an important phrase, gateway. It tells us that the Norse presence in North America was likely not centred entirely on one permanent colonial town. It was organised around movement, staging, repair and extraction. The settlement itself was practical, not grand. Parks Canada notes evidence of bog iron smelting and forging, wooden debris and broken nails from ship repair, along with domestic items such as a bone needle fragment, whetstone, spindle whorl, and the famous bronze ring-headed cloakpin that helped confirm the site's Norse identity. This is one of the most appealing things about Lons aux Meadows. It is not merely symbolic, it is ordinary in the best archaeological sense. People worked there, they repaired things there, they smelted iron there, they wore pins, handled tools and lived in turf-walled buildings because one cannot subsist entirely on heroic reputation. If you want to cross an ocean and come back again, eventually somebody has to mend the ship, sharpen the tool, patch the clothing, and deal with the eternal human burden of practical maintenance. Exploration has always depended on people willing to do the boring parts well. The site also tells us the Norse did not remain fixed to Newfoundland alone. Parks Canada points to the discovery of butternuts and a butternut burl at Lons aux Meadows, materials whose northern range lies well south of Newfoundland, in places such as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. That strongly suggests travel farther south than the excavated base itself. In other words, the Norse had reached a northern foothold and were ranging outward from it, probably in search of useful resources. This fits the saga picture rather well. A base in the north, excursions beyond, cargoes of timber and other goods, and a lingering sense that Vinland may have named a broader southern opportunity, rather than one precisely bounded settlement. Medieval geography, much like modern holiday planning, is often fuzzier around the edges than people later pretend. Yet for all their maritime skill, the Norse were not alone on these coasts, and that is a point no responsible telling should soften into scenery. Parks Canada's management plan notes that Lons aux Meadows had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for at least 4,000 years before the Norse arrived, with earlier occupations by maritime archaic, Grosswater, Dorset, and later distinct indigenous cultures in the wider area. The Norse did not sail into an empty hemisphere waiting patiently to be noticed. They entered lands already known, used and inhabited by others. The sagas preserved memory of encounters with indigenous people, whom the Norse called Skraelings, and Parks Canada's interpretation notes that conflict with native people, may have contributed to the site's abandonment. Whatever the exact sequence, the edge of the known sea was already someone else's world too. That helps explain why the Norse presence in North America remained limited. The camps in the west were remote even by Greenlandic standards. Supplies had to be managed across extraordinary distances. Weather-constrained movement, communication with the Scandinavian core was weak and indirect. Any sustained settlement would have required not just courage, but a durable economic model, manageable relations with indigenous populations, and a larger strategic reason to keep investing effort in land so far from the centres of Norse power. None of those conditions seems to have fully stabilised. Parks Canada suggests the site may have been occupied for only a few years, with summer explorations radiating out from it. That is not failure exactly. It is something more common in history, a real expansion that reached its practical limit. There is something revealing in that modest scale. We are used to thinking of exploration as the opening act of conquest, as though every voyage naturally wants to become a map full of flags. The Northwestern expeditions show a different pattern. They reached North America, exploited resources, probably scouted farther than their one confirmed site, and then did not transform that foothold into a lasting Atlantic system. The ocean could be crossed, but it did not become easy. The land could be visited, but it did not become securely held. A camp could be established, but not necessarily reproduced at the scale needed to hold history's attention for long. This is one reason Vinland later became so ghostly in Europe. The contact was real, but its institutional consequences were limited. A place can be found without being folded permanently into a civilization's central picture of the world. Meanwhile, Greenland itself remained precarious. Britannica notes that the Norse settlements there may have reached several thousand people and survived into the 15th century, but they declined during the later medieval centuries, likely under the pressure of climatic cooling and other stresses. The National Museum of Denmark emphasises their reliance on trade and imported materials, a sign of structural vulnerability from the beginning. If the main western base of Norse Atlantic life was already dependent, distant and ecologically tight, then the still farther western ventures were always going to be difficult to sustain. It is one thing to launch an expedition from a frontier. It is another to maintain generations of meaningful contact through that frontier when the frontier itself is beginning to weaken. The Norse at the edge of the sea were capable, but capability is not the same thing as permanence. What remains especially striking is how much of this larger picture can now be reconstructed from the combination of archaeology and literary tradition. These sagas tell of Leif's camp, summer voyages, timber gathering, and clashes with indigenous inhabitants. The archaeological site provides turf halls, ironworking, ship repair evidence, and southern plant materials. The 1021 date anchors Norse activity in North America to a specific year. None of this turns the sagas into flawless transcripts, but it does vindicate them as vessels of real historical memory. They were preserving something substantial about Western travel from Greenland even after generations of retelling. That is no small achievement. Oral tradition is often mocked by people who trust paper too much. Though paper, as we shall be seeing again with the Vinland Map, has its own talent for misbehaving, there is also the visual side of it, which matters more than we sometimes admit. Parks Canada emphasises that the surrounding landscape of Lonso Meadows has changed little in 1,000 years, and that the viewscapes of the Strait of Belle Isle, offshore islands, and the Labrador coast formed part of the Norse navigational world. That image is worth holding for a moment. A narrow terrace, bogs and barrens, low buildings under sod, cold air moving off the water, and beyond it all a strait that was both passage and warning. This was not the centre of any medieval kingdom. It was not a rich capital or famous port. It was a functional outpost at the point where one known world thinned into another. The Norse were not standing at the edge of fantasy. They were standing at the edge of reach. And perhaps that is why the Western voyages mattered so deeply in memory even after they faded in practice. They represented a human threshold, Nature's paper on the 1021 date remarks that this provides the first known point at which humans had effectively encircled the globe. That is a large claim, but it is grounded in a simple fact. By then, people had moved across Eurasia, Africa, the Pacific, the Americas, and now the Atlantic too. The planet's far edges had, however, briefly and unevenly touched. The Norse crews who reached Newfoundland did not know they were completing a global human circuit. They were after resources, opportunity, and perhaps advantage for Greenland. But history has a way of making practical journeys look monumental later. Sailors go looking for timber and end up bending the shape of world history by accident. Still, if you had asked a 15th century European scholar in Paris, Florence, or Nuremberg what exactly lay beyond Greenland, the answer would probably not have reflected all this northern experience in any confident or systematic way. That is the key tension. The Norse had been there. The archaeology confirms it. Some memories survived in texts. Adam of Bremen had even mentioned Vinland on the continent. Yet the wider map of Europe did not fully absorb this Western knowledge in a durable, practical way. It remained stranded in the north, partially remembered, never quite strong enough to redraw the common picture of the world, which is why, once we leave the sailors and return to the desks of medieval map makers, the real question becomes not whether the Norse reached the Western lands, but how a Europe that only half remembered such things tried to draw a world it did not entirely know. If you had handed a modern atlas to a medieval European scholar, the first surprise might not have been the continents, or the projection, or the lack of decorative sea creatures. It might have been the assumption hidden inside it. The assumption that a map's main purpose is to describe physical space as accurately and neutrally as possible. Medieval Europe did not always begin there. A map could certainly help with geography, routes, coasts, and distance, but it could also do something larger. It could organise sacred history, moral order, inherited learning, political imagination, pilgrimage, trade, and the strange but very human desire to fit the known world into a form that made sense. In other words, medieval Europe did not draw the world with one single aim. It drew the world the way it understood the world, and those are not quite the same thing. That is one reason medieval maps so often confuse modern eyes. We look at them and immediately begin checking coastlines like stern examiners. Why is East at the top? Why is Jerusalem in the middle? Why does the shape of Africa seem unhelpfully imaginative? And why, in some cases, does the edge of the world appear to contain a more enthusiastic number of marvels than any ordinary traveller would request? The answer is not that medieval Europeans were incapable of observation, or uninterested in practical geography. It is that many of their maps were doing more than one job at once. They were not merely trying to show where things were, they were trying to show what the world meant. One of the clearest examples is the broad family of maps we call Mappe Mundi, world maps that often place the inhabited Earth into a Christian frame of reference. Britannica notes that medieval maps frequently placed Jerusalem at the centre and East at the top, and that the classic T-map or T&O scheme divided the known world into Asia, Europe and Africa using the Mediterranean, Nile and related waters to create the rough form of a T inside the surrounding O of the encircling ocean. To a modern viewer that can look simplistic, almost childlike. But it was not meant as a childish sketch. It was a structured image of the inhabited world, one that aligned geography with a sacred and inherited vision of history. East was not just a compass direction. It was the direction of Eden, of origins, of orientation in the deepest sense. That word orientation is helpful here, because it reminds us that maps are never innocent. To orient a map is to decide what goes at the top and what matters most. In the modern North Atlantic world, north became the familiar upward direction through a long practical and cartographic history. But there is nothing inevitable about that. Medieval Europe often preferred eastward orientation because east carried spiritual weight. The centre, likewise, was not always chosen because it was geometrically optimal. Jerusalem stood at the centre of many maps because salvation history placed it there, and because medieval map-making often worked by hierarchy of meaning as much as by measured distance. A place could be central because it mattered most, not because a modern surveyor had triangulated it. The Hereford Mappa Mundi shows this beautifully. Hereford Cathedral describes it as a record of how 13th century scholars interpreted the world in spiritual as well as geographical terms, with Jerusalem at the centre. Created around 1300 on a single sheet of vellum, it includes around 500 drawings, cities and towns, biblical scenes, plants, animals, peoples, and figures from classical mythology. That description alone tells you almost everything about medieval cartographic priorities. This was not a stripped-down navigational sheet to be tucked into a shipmaster's chest between rope and salted provisions. It was a vast visual encyclopedia of the world as understood through scripture, history, rumour, classical inheritance, and geography all at once. A map, yes, but also a teaching device, a memory theatre, a moral diagram, and a storehouse of stories. This is the point where modern people are sometimes tempted to laugh politely at the strange creatures and move on, as though medieval map makers had simply decorated ignorance with imagination. That is too easy, and it misses the seriousness of what those maps were doing. The marvels on a Mappa Mundi were not random doodles by a bored scribe on a long afternoon. They often represented distant peoples and creatures described in inherited texts, travel accounts, natural history, and moralised learning. The Hereford Map's strange beings and mythological images do not make it less informative in the medieval sense. They make it more complete according to the intellectual habits of its world. If a culture believed the world consisted not only of coastlines and settlements, but also of sacred events, ancient authorities, foreign rulers, wonders, and moral lessons, then a full map of the world ought to contain them. A silent map might have looked less sophisticated, not more. And these maps were often encountered in manuscript settings that reinforced exactly that wider purpose. British Library catalogue records show world maps appearing in manuscripts like Ranulph Higden's Polychronicon, and in the prefatory material of Matthew Paris's historical works, alongside itineraries, calendars, and texts of universal history. That context matters because it reminds us that maps in medieval Europe were frequently companions to reading, not just substitutes for travel. They lived in books, chronicles, commentaries, and compilations. You encountered them as part of a learned conversation about the shape of the world, the sequence of history, the place of peoples, and the ordering of Christian knowledge. A map was not always an isolated object pinned to a wall. It was often one page in a larger intellectual machine. Even the simplest T&O renderings fit this manuscript culture well. They could function almost like diagrams, compact enough to be inserted into texts, and memorable enough to summarise a worldview at a glance. A circle for the inhabited world, a tripartite division for the 3 continents, and the implication that the whole human story unfolded inside an ordered creation. To modern eyes, that looks like a loss of detail. To medieval readers, it could be a gain in intelligibility. The point was not merely to crowd the page with every harbour and headland, it was to make the world thinkable. There are times when a diagram tells you more about a civilization's mind than a perfect coastline ever could. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine that medieval Europe only produced symbolic or theological maps. That is the other half of the picture, and it is just as important. As seafaring expanded and commercial navigation intensified, especially in the Mediterranean, another map tradition matured alongside the Grand Mappae Mundi, the Portolan chart. Britannica describes Portolan charts as navigational charts of the European Middle Ages, flourishing from about 1300 to 1500, characterised by rum lines radiating in the directions of wind or compass points, and used by pilots to lay courses from harbour to harbour. The earliest dated example, made by Petrus Visconti at Genoa in 1311, is often treated as a marker of professional cartography. In other words, by the 14th century, medieval Europe was also drawing the world in a much more practical way, when practical conditions demanded it. Portolan charts are often startling to modern viewers because their coastlines can look much more familiar than those on famous world maps. The reason is simple enough. They were built for sailors. A Portolan chart did not need to moralise your soul, explain salvation history, or show where Alexander the Great had once marched. It needed to help you move along coasts, find harbours, and survive navigation. That purpose narrowed the focus and sharpened the execution. Britannica notes that most surviving Portolans were made in Italy or Catalonia, often on vellum, and that while Italian examples tended to focus on Western Europe and the Mediterranean, some Catalan charts could take on the scale of world maps. That distinction is crucial. It means late medieval cartography was not divided into a pure choice between symbolic fantasy and practical science. There were hybrids, overlaps, and traditions that borrowed from each other. The Catalan Atlas is perhaps the clearest example of that hybrid world. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France describes it as an illuminated set of maps bound like a book and intended for the King of France, offering an image of the totality of the known world in its time. It combined geographical, political and economic information with antique legends and the marvels of distant Asia. Drawing on medieval narratives such as Marco Polo's account, that one description captures the medieval style almost perfectly. You could have trade intelligence and marvels on the same page, practical geography and inherited legend sharing a sheet quite happily. The medieval mapmaker did not always feel compelled to choose between the useful and the wondrous. On a good day, one could reinforce the other. This helps explain something essential. Medieval Europe did not possess one map tradition but several, and they did not replace each other in a neat staircase. A great world map in a cathedral, a diagrammatic TO image in a manuscript, a Portolan chart in a maritime context, and a route map or regional sheet could all coexist. The Bodleian's Goth map of Great Britain, dating from around 1390, shows yet another approach. The Bodleian describes it as the oldest surviving sheet map of Britain, oriented with east at the top, showing more than 200 rivers and more than 600 towns and settlements, with red lines that may represent routes and distances. This is not a world map, and it is not a Portolan. It is a practical, terrestrial map of a realm, and it shows that medieval cartography could become surprisingly specific when the purpose required it. That eastward orientation on the Goth map is especially revealing. It reminds us that even relatively practical maps did not always obey modern habits. Orientation remained a choice shaped by working methods, cultural inheritance, and material convenience. The Bodleian notes that east at the top made the long shape of the map easier to work with, and that detail is pleasantly ordinary. Sometimes the history of ideas is lofty, and sometimes it is simply about what fits better on animal skin. Medieval maps lived at the intersection of symbolism and craft. They were drawn by people who inherited cosmologies, yes, but who also had to decide where to place a river on parchment without running into the join between two pieces of skin. That kind of physical realism does a great deal to humanise the whole subject. Another major shift arrived with the revival of Ptolemy. Britannica notes that Ptolemy's geography, with its system of latitude and longitude, and its list of thousands of locations, had influenced Byzantine and later Renaissance cartographers. In Western Europe, the full work in Greek was recovered and translated into Latin around 1405, and printed editions began appearing from 1477 onward. The revival did not instantly erase older mapping habits, but it gave European scholars a more formal mathematical framework for representing the inhabited world. Coordinates, projection, duplication, and the authority of a classical geographer all returned to the conversation with renewed force. That meant that late medieval and early Renaissance cartography increasingly lived in dialogue with an older scientific tradition that offered a different standard of rigour. This recovery of Ptolemy came at an especially consequential moment. Printing made maps easier to reproduce consistently, exploration was expanding, and practical maritime knowledge was deepening. Britannica describes this conjunction as helping create a golden era of cartography. But the really important point for our purposes is that the 15th century was not a simple medieval afterglow, nor a fully modern break. It was a crowded transitional moment. Symbolic world maps still mattered. Porterland practices remained powerful. Regional maps developed in their own ways. Ptolemaic methods returned with growing authority. New discoveries were beginning to pressure inherited pictures of the world. That is exactly the kind of environment in which a map could look both old and new at once, and in which the lines between inherited form and updated content could become very interesting indeed. There is also the question of sources, which medieval mapmakers handled with a blend of diligence and vulnerability. Very few mapmakers saw everything they drew, obviously. They relied on classical texts, biblical exegesis, travellers' reports, merchants' knowledge, sailors' experience, copied exemplars, and other maps. The BNF's description of the Catalan Atlas is helpful again here, because it explicitly notes the mixing of geographic, political, and economic information with legends and wonders drawn from medieval accounts like Marco Polo. That means information could travel into maps through many channels, and not all channels were equal. A ruler, a monk, a merchant, and a mariner might all contribute something to how space was imagined, even if only one of them had ever seen the place in question. Medieval mapmaking was therefore both cumulative and precarious. It assembled the world from reports, and reports are never entirely obedient. Copying added another layer of instability. Maps in manuscripts could be recopied, redrawn, simplified, expanded, glossed, or updated. Details could be introduced by later hands, labels could shift. Blank spaces invited additions. The Bodleian's work on the Goth map even found evidence of pinpricks suggesting tracing from an older model, a reminder that mapmaking could involve direct transfer as well as freehand invention. That is important because it means a medieval or early map was rarely a pure original in the modern artistic sense. It was often part of a lineage. To study such a map is to ask not only what it shows, but what earlier traditions it inherits, what contemporary knowledge it absorbs, and what later interventions may have altered it. A line on vellum can be older than the knowledge it appears to convey, or newer than the parchment on which it sits. This will sound familiar later for obvious reasons. So when we say medieval Europe drew the world, we should really say assembled worlds in plural. It drew a sacred world centred on Jerusalem. It drew a navigational world of coasts and harbours. It drew a royal world of routes, towns and territories. It drew manuscript worlds packed with historical and biblical meaning. It drew learned worlds increasingly shaped by Ptolemaic coordinates. Sometimes these worlds stayed apart, sometimes they overlapped on the same page. A medieval map is therefore best understood not as a failed modern map, but as a successful medieval one, doing the work its maker and audience expected of it. To judge it fairly, you have to ask not only, is it accurate, but accurate for what? That question matters enormously when the Vinland Map enters the story, because by the 15th century a map could plausibly combine older world map habits with newer kinds of geographical information. It could look manuscript-like, learned, and conservative in some respects, while also carrying more specific coastal or regional updates. That is one reason the Vinland Map was able to provoke such debate. Its defenders could point to a late medieval cartographic environment full of mixtures, transitions, copied knowledge, and uneven styles. Its critics could point to the same environment and say that precisely because we know how these traditions behaved, we can test whether this document truly fits among them. Once you understand how medieval Europe drew the world, the map in question becomes both more plausible as an idea and more vulnerable as an object. And that is where the next difficulty begins, because whatever else medieval maps allowed themselves to be, a western coastline placed where none was expected would still need to answer a very direct question. What exactly is the shape of that coast doing there? What made the Vinland Map so unsettling was not simply that it used the word Vinland. A name alone could have been explained away as rumour, legend, literary borrowing, or one more medieval habit of writing distant things into the margins. What gave the map its charge was that it seemed to do something more specific. It appeared to draw a western land, not a vague suggestion, not a decorative flourish, but an outlined place southwest of Greenland, labelled Vinlanda Insula and treated as part of the geography of the world. Yale's own catalogue describes the object as an outline map of Europe, Africa, Asia and surrounding seas, including Iceland, Greenland and Vinland, while later Yale commentary notes that the document was famous precisely because it appeared to show a pre-Columbian section of North American coastline southwest of Greenland. That is the point where the map stopped being merely curious and became dangerous to settled chronology. Medieval Europe could preserve echoes of distant lands. It could inherit old reports and fit them into texts. But a coastline has a different weight from a rumour. Once a map maker draws ashore, however approximately, the implication is that some body of geographic knowledge has crossed the threshold from story into form. Even if the outline is rough, even if the scale is odd, even if the placement is imperfect, a coast announces itself differently from a line in a chronicle. It says someone, somewhere, believed this place belonged on the page as geography. And if that page really belonged to the 15th century, then the western edge of Europe's knowledge would have been broader than most historians had allowed. Visually, the western portion is not huge, but it is commanding because of where it sits and how little else competes with it. The Vinland Map is modest in size, roughly placemat-sized according to Yale, and much less ornamented than many famous medieval maps. It does not distract the eye with elaborate cities, gilded rulers, or swarms of monsters. The West is comparatively bare. That spareness may actually have helped the illusion, because it gives the lines a practical feel. The viewer is left staring not at decoration but at shape. In a dense cathedral map full of wonders, a mysterious western island might have dissolved into the page. Here it stands apart. It behaves less like an allegory and more like a claim. The label intensified that claim. Contemporary descriptions of the map note that the legend by the western land reads, in translation, that Vinland was discovered by Bjarni and Leif, while a longer legend nearby links the region to Bishop Erik of Greenland. That combination matters because it anchors the shape to named Norse figures and to an apparently historical framework rather than leaving it as a purely anonymous island. In other words, the map was not merely saying, there may be something over here. It was saying more or less, this is Vinland, the place associated with the Norse westward ventures. That made the coast legible to 20th century scholars in exactly the way a sensational artifact needs to be. It did not ask to be decoded by a secret society. It told interested people almost immediately why they should care. But the real disturbance lay in the shape itself and in its neighbourhood. Yale curator Raymond Clemens summarised the map as containing depictions of Greenland, Iceland and the east coast of Newfoundland. That is already an extraordinary sentence. Not an island in the outer ocean, or a legendary land to the west, but a depiction that later scholars could describe specifically in relation to Newfoundland. One reason the map remained controversial for so long is that the West was suggestive enough to invite recognition. People could look at it and feel they were not merely looking at fantasy. The lines seemed to be trying, however imperfectly, to represent a real North Atlantic arrangement. That sort of resemblance is powerful, especially when it aligns with what we already know from the Norse record. The Greenlanders and Icelanders really did reach lands in North America around the year 1000. Yet resemblance is also where historical judgment becomes slippery. Humans are extremely good at recognizing patterns, sometimes too good. Give us an irregular island on an old map and a modern coastline in our minds, and we'll start introducing them to each other with embarrassing enthusiasm. The danger is not foolishness, so much as eagerness. The Vinland shape did not need to be exact to seem suggestive. In fact, roughness could help it, because medieval maps are allowed a certain amount of looseness. A perfect Newfoundland would have looked suspiciously modern. A generalised, slightly detached, island-like western land could look plausible as an inherited memory of a coast imperfectly transmitted. The map sat right in that narrow, sweet spot where imprecision made it feel older, while recognition made it feel true. Greenland made the problem even sharper. In much medieval northern cartography, Greenland was not drawn as a neatly separate island in the modern sense, but as a peninsula or northern extension attached to Eurasian space. Scholarly discussion of the Vinland Map repeatedly stressed that point. Ib Kaelbo noted that the Vinland Map took the opposite and correct view, that Greenland is an island surrounded by sea, whereas the Icelandic map tradition he reviewed treated Greenland as a peninsula. Earlier scholarship on Claudius Clavus likewise connected 15th century representations of Greenland to northern peninsula forms, so if the Vinland Map really were medieval, it was not only showing a western land, it was also handling Greenland in a way that looked unexpectedly advanced in comparison with many earlier northern models. That is one reason the map's west felt at once convincing and suspicious. On the one hand, a person inclined to believe could say this was exactly what lost northern knowledge might look like. Perhaps a cartographer with access to information derived from Norse traditions knew Greenland was insular and had some memory, however generalised, of lands beyond it. On the other hand, a skeptic could say the same feature looked too clever. Why does this map get Greenland right while other surrounding elements remain less impressive? Why does Norway not suddenly receive the same miraculous improvement? Why does the western fringe look like the very place where a later forger, equipped with hindsight, would make targeted corrections? A fake often fails by being wildly impossible. A better fake fails by being selectively brilliant. The Old World portion of the map complicated matters further. Reviewers quickly noticed that much of Europe, Africa, and Asia resembled the world map in Andrea Bianco's 1436 Atlas, or something close to it. That was initially reassuring, because a 15th century looking world map ought to have medieval cartographic relatives. But later work sharpened the problem. Clemens reported that while the map had long been thought to draw on Bianco, John Paul Floyd showed it was actually based not on Bianco's original 1436 map, but on a printed facsimile produced in 1782. With copying mistakes from that facsimile reproduced on the Vinland Map, that is devastating because it changes the nature of the West. If the base map is not a genuine 15th century original source, but a modern copy of a medieval source, then the western coast ceases to look like a survival of lost knowledge and begins to look like an insertion on top of a borrowed shell. This is where the coast starts to look less like a memory and more like a surgical alteration. If most of the Old World is derivative from an existing model, then the real action lies in the revisions, especially in the far west. Earlier debate already noticed that the map made major alterations at the edges, while much of the rest followed familiar lines. That asymmetry is telling. A genuine medieval cartographer might certainly revise a source map with new information. That happened all the time. But if the revisions happen in exactly the zones where modern readers most want a dramatic revelation, suspicion rises very quickly. It is rather like finding an old family recipe that is identical to the original, except in the one place that would prove your rival aunt wrong after 30 years. Possible, yes. Convenient, also, yes. The West therefore became a test case not only in cartography, but in historical psychology. How much irregularity is medieval? How much resemblance counts as independent knowledge? How much almost right should persuade us? With the Vinland landmass, believers could say the very crudity of the outline supported authenticity. Medieval map makers did not work from satellite imagery. A transmitted memory of a coast would naturally become simplified and insular on the page. Critics could reply that this vagueness was exactly what made the shape useful to a forger. An outline broad enough to evoke Newfoundland, Greenlandic knowledge, and Norse Western travel without being held to exact standards is a very forgiving kind of deception. It invites the viewer to complete the argument mentally, and once the viewer does that work for the map has already won half the battle. There were also details in the surrounding text that made the western section feel not just geographically daring, but philologically awkward. Reviews from the earliest years of the controversy pointed out that the map's treatment of Bjarni and Leif was unusual enough to prompt debate because it appeared to make them joint discoverers in a way not straightforwardly mirrored in the surviving saga narratives. That is not a death blow on its own. Medieval compilers often compress and rearrange traditions, but in a document already under pressure, every oddity in the legend threw more weight onto the line itself. The coast no longer stood alone. It came attached to wording that looked as though someone had assembled a Norse backstory from later learned knowledge, not simply copied a stable medieval tradition. Then modern science arrived and made the coast physically betray itself. Yale's 2021 analysis found titanium throughout the map's ink, and reported especially high levels of titanium and smaller amounts of barium in the Vinland insular area, consistent with early 20th century titanium white pigments, rather than normal medieval iron gall ink. The researchers also identified altered writing on the reverse, done in the same modern kind of ink, apparently to make the map look more convincingly tied to the medieval speculum manuscript. Once that evidence is in view, the Western shape changes character again. It is no longer merely suspiciously apt, it becomes materially modern. The coast that no one should have known turns into a coast someone in the 20th century very much did know, and very likely drew with that knowledge in mind. And yet even that does not make the shape historically boring, quite the opposite. Because once the map's western coast is understood as modern intervention on old parchment, a new question emerges. What sort of modern mind would design it this way? The answer seems to be a mind that understood the power of ambiguity, too accurate, and the forgery would collapse into absurdity. Too fantastical, and it would be dismissed as nonsense. What the forger needed was a West that looked just medieval enough to excuse distortion, and just recognisable enough to tempt comparison with real North Atlantic geography. He also needed the right supporting cast. Greenland treated as an island, Vinland named explicitly, Norse discoverers invoked, and the whole thing placed inside a world map, old enough to make the claim explosive. In a grimly admiring way, it is a clever design. There's another reason the Western shape held attention for so long. It sat on top of a true historical possibility. Norse voyages did reach North America centuries before Columbus, and the archaeology at Lonso Meadows confirms that. So the West on the Vinland map was not asking people to believe in something wholly impossible. It was asking them to believe in a surviving cartographic witness to something already half accepted. That is why the coastline had such persuasive force. It was parasitic on real history. A forgery attached to a false event must manufacture everything. A forgery attached to a true event only has to counterfeit the missing evidence. That is a much easier and much more dangerous thing to do. Seen from that angle, the Western landmass becomes almost a study in historical seduction. It flatters scholarship. It says the archive was richer than we knew. It says the Middle Ages may have preserved more northern knowledge than later centuries remembered. It says there is a gap in the story, and here at last is the document that bridges it. Historians, being human, are susceptible to that kind of gift just like anyone else. The shape of the coast made the promise visual. You could point to it, you could trace it, you could overlay it in your mind against the map of the North Atlantic and feel the small thrill of recognition. A written claim can always be argued with. A line on parchment seems to possess its own quiet confidence. But perhaps the strongest lesson of that Western shape is more general. A coastline is never just a coastline on a historical map. It is an argument about what was knowable, transmissible, and drawable at a given moment. The Vinland Map's western land looked persuasive because it occupied the exact zone where knowledge, wish, and plausibility overlapped. It was close enough to real North Atlantic geography to feel consequential, but still flexible enough to survive medieval looseness. Once later, research showed that the map reproduced mistakes from an 18th century facsimile and carried 20th century ink. The coast stopped being evidence for lost medieval cartography and became evidence for something else. how expertly modern fabrication can exploit the visual authority of old maps. So the coast on the Vinland Map was never just a shape someone shouldn't have known. It was a shape designed to make us ask who knew what, when, and by what route, while quietly hiding the more immediate possibility that the person who knew it best was not a 15th century cleric at all, but a much later hand choosing exactly how much truth to borrow. And once that possibility enters, the line between geography and deception narrows dramatically, which is why the next place the story has to go is away from coastlines and into the smaller, less romantic world of pigments, parchment, and laboratory instruments, where maps lose their mystery very quickly if the chemistry starts talking. If the coastline tempted people into wonder, the ink pulled them back toward a very different mood. Because maps may speak in grand historical implications, but laboratories are less romantic. A lab does not care whether a document would beautifully revise the history of exploration. It cares what is on the page, what is in the line, what sits between fibres, what can be measured, and whether the story an object tells about itself survives contact with chemistry. In the case of the Vinland Map, that is where the mystery changed shape. The question stopped being only, could medieval Europeans have known this, and became the much more exacting question, when were these lines actually put onto this parchment? That distinction is everything. Old parchment does not automatically mean old drawing. This is one of the first lessons in the science of suspicious documents, and it is an almost impolite lesson because it ruins the comforting idea that one date can settle everything. Parchment is animal skin. It can survive for centuries. It can also be cut, rebound, erased, reused, or written upon long after the animal itself has stopped caring about any of this. So when scientists ask whether a map is authentic, they are not asking one single question. They are asking several at once. How old is the support? How old is the ink? How does the writing behave microscopically? Does the material match what a medieval scribe or mapmaker would likely have used? And do the physical clues agree with the document's claimed history? Or do they begin quietly disagreeing in the margins? The Vinland Map became a perfect case study in this layered kind of suspicion because, maddeningly, some of its materials really were old. Radiocarbon dating of the parchment, published in 2002, placed the calf skin support in the 15th century, with a calibrated central date around AD 1434 and a 95% confidence range of AD 1411 to 1468. That sounded at first glance like a major victory for authenticity. A map claiming to be from the mid-15th century was at least written on parchment that could indeed have existed then. For believers, this felt like the kind of result that should calm the room. For skeptics, it was interesting but never decisive, because parchment dating tells you when the animal died, not when the drawing was made. A forged map on genuine medieval parchment is still a forged map. It is just one with better wardrobe choices. That is why the ink mattered so much more than many casual observers first realised. Ink is closer to the act of deception, if deception there is. It belongs to the hand, not merely to the material the hand happened to use. And almost from the start, the Vinland Map's ink looked strange. Early visual and microscopic observations had already raised questions, but the great turning point came with Walter Macrone's work in the 1970s. Macrone's analyses found titanium dioxide in the form of anatus in the yellow lines of the map, and he argued that this pointed to a modern origin, because the particular pigmentary form he identified was associated with 20th century manufacture. His institute's retrospective summary reports that he found titanium dioxide anatus in multiple samples and considered the finding incompatible with a medieval date for the map's ink. That result was explosive, but not terminal. This is another important lesson in how scientific controversies behave. A dramatic result does not automatically end a debate if the object is famous enough, the stakes are high enough, or the method leaves any room at all for dispute. And the Vinland Map had all three. It was prestigious, expensive, institutionally sensitive, and tied to a public historical question people badly wanted resolved. So instead of dying quickly, the debate became technical. Was the anaters really in the ink and not contamination from elsewhere? Was it natural or manufactured? Were the samples representative? Had one analysis measured the right part of the line while another had mainly measured the parchment beneath it? Once a controversy reaches that point, ordinary readers begin to feel as though they have accidentally wandered into a room where several very intelligent people are arguing over dust with life-changing intensity, which in this case is more or less what happened. Part of the confusion came from the appearance of the lines themselves. The map was not drawn in one clean uniform ink layer. Researchers observed a yellowish line strongly adhered to the parchment, with black material overlying it in places. Brown and Clark's 2002 Raman microprobe study concluded that the black line consisted of carbon laid over a yellow line containing anatase, and they argued that such a combination strongly indicated a modern origin after 1923. Their abstract is careful but devastating. Anatase, they wrote, had not been found on medieval artifacts in this way, and the yellow lines behaved unlike what one would expect from ordinary medieval iron gall ink aging naturally across the page. Instead, the structure suggested a more artificial attempt to imitate age. That phrase, imitate age, captures the whole psychological drama of the object. A convincing forgery does not merely invent content, it manufactures wear, chronology, and visual plausibility. Medieval iron gall ink can yellow and brown as it ages, but Brown and Clark argued that on the Vinland Map the sequence looked wrong. A yellow line containing anatase with black carbon on top, as though a forger had separated the functions of old-looking base and visible top line. Scientific American's summary of the study noted exactly this point, explaining that the researchers suggested the two components had been applied separately to create the appearance of antiquity. In other words, the map did not simply contain suspicious material. It may have been staged to look medieval in the very act of drawing, and still the matter did not quite die. That is the frustrating beauty of scientific suspicion. It accumulates, it narrows, it sharpens, but sometimes it does not land in one blow because different tests are probing different questions. The parchment date remained medieval. The ink looked modern. Some researchers proposed explanations involving contamination or naturally occurring titanium-bearing particles. Others emphasized that one could not radiocarbon date the ink directly without taking too much material from the map. Scientific American noted this limitation plainly in 2002. Carbon testing of the ink itself was not feasible because the amount required would have been prohibitively large. That gap left room, not necessarily for good arguments, but for continued arguments, which are never quite the same thing. This is why the Vinland Map survived in scholarly limbo for so long. The evidence was not balanced in some equal dramatic suspense, but it was distributed awkwardly. One class of evidence said the skin was old, another said the drawing was new. Since people understandably like one object to possess one date and one identity, the split was difficult for non-specialists to digest. Add to that the prestige of Yale, the map's association with genuine medieval manuscripts, and the irresistible possibility that it might preserve lost Norse knowledge, and you had a controversy built to last. It was not that science was failing, it was that science was revealing a more complicated and less emotionally satisfying reality than the public likes. Objects can be old and false at once. The past is perfectly capable of lending its body to a lie. By the time Yale returned to the problem with a major in-house analytical campaign announced in 2021, the tools had become much better. This matters because conservation science is often a story of scale and resolution. Earlier researchers had sampled points. Later researchers could map entire distributions across a document, compare many medieval controls, and combine elemental imaging with molecular and electron microscopy in ways that earlier decades simply could not. Yale's team described its study as the most thorough analysis yet performed on the map. Instead of asking only whether anatase could be found in a few spots, They examined the elemental composition across the whole document and found that a titanium compound pervaded the map's lines and text. That shift from isolated detection to broad distribution was crucial. It made the titanium harder to dismiss as accidental local contamination. Yale then used Raman microscopy to confirm that the titanium dioxide present in the ink was indeed annatus, and not merely some vague titanium-bearing background noise. That step matters because scientific debates often hinge on specificity. It is one thing to say titanium is present somewhere. It is another to identify the relevant mineral form in the lines themselves. Yale also compared the map's ink to inks from 50 genuine 15th century Central European manuscript fragments in the Beinecke collections. Those authentic fragments, made at roughly the time the Vinland Map claimed to be from, contained far lower levels of titanium and much higher levels of iron than the map. That comparative method is particularly persuasive because it shifts the question from abstract possibility to practical historical context. Medieval inks are not theoretical. We have many of them. If the Vinland Map's ink behaves unlike the real 15th century inks around it, that is bad news for the map. The electron microscopy results pushed the conclusion even farther. Yale reported that field emission scanning electron microscopy showed annatus particles in the ink that closely resembled those found in a pigment commercially produced in Norway in 1923. This is one of those wonderfully brutal moments in forensic work when the argument stops sounding medieval entirely and starts sounding industrial. Instead of a monk or mapmaker at a 15th century desk, we are suddenly staring at a material signature tied to modern pigment manufacture. The romance of lost exploration knowledge tends to struggle when the particles begin pointing toward 20th century Scandinavian chemistry. And then there was the reverse side, which turned suspicion into intention. Yale's 2021 analysis found that a Latin inscription on the back of the map, possibly an old binder's note related to the authentic medieval Speculum Historiale volume from which the parchment likely came, had been overwritten with modern ink to make it appear that the map had belonged within that genuine manuscript. Clemens called this powerful evidence of forgery rather than innocent later association. That is a very important distinction. A strange object can sometimes become accidentally attached to authentic materials. But if the inscription itself has been altered in modern ink to strengthen the illusion of medieval association, then the object is no longer merely questionable. It is participating in a deception. Someone was not simply making a map. Someone was helping the map tell a false biography. That, in a sense, is the deepest function of laboratory work in manuscript studies. It does not just test age, it tests narrative. Every material feature belongs to a story the object is trying to tell. The parchment says, "I am old." The ink says, "Perhaps not." The overwritten inscription says, "I was made to seem connected to this genuine codex." The comparative manuscript fragments say, "This is not how our inks behave." The electron microscope says, "These particles belong to a modern production history." One by one, the object's own physical components stop harmonizing. When that happens, the role of the scientist is not to produce drama, but to listen carefully to which part of the object is lying. It is worth appreciating too how physically invasive and ethically delicate some of this work can be. The 2002 radiocarbon study was possible only because Yale had, years earlier, allowed a narrow strip to be cut from the lower right corner of the map. That is not the sort of decision conservators make lightly, especially with a famous artifact. The reason researchers could not simply solve everything at once is that each test cost material, and rare documents do not regenerate like fingernails. One of the odd dignities of conservation science is that it works under restraint. You are trying to learn as much as possible while damaging as little as possible, which means some questions remain open longer than anyone would prefer. The map's ambiguity was prolonged partly by its own fragility. This is also why forgers sometimes prosper for a while. They do not need to defeat science forever. They only need to survive the limits of cautious investigation long enough to enter collections, scholarship or public imagination. The Vinland Map did exactly that. It benefited from genuine medieval parchment, from association with authentic manuscripts, from the historical plausibility of Norse contact with North America, and from the practical limits of destructive testing. It asked every generation of researchers a slightly different question as tools improved. In the 1960s and 1970s, the issue was whether suspicious pigments were present. In 2002, the issue became the split between parchment age and ink character. By 2021, the issue was no longer merely whether modern material could be detected, but whether that modern material was distributed so systematically and linked so clearly to deliberate alteration that reasonable doubt finally ran out. Yale's answer was yes. There is something almost poetic in the way the map failed, though not in the way the map wanted. It tried to borrow medieval authority through skin, script and association. It tried to speak in the voice of an older world. But the tiniest constituents of matter refused to cooperate. Pigment particles, elemental maps, Raman spectra, electron images, and control comparisons slowly stripped the performance away. The map's great claim concerned exploration across the Atlantic, but its undoing came from exploration at the microscopic scale. It was betrayed not by some sweeping historical argument, but by dust-sized evidence that would not stay medieval under magnification. And yet the science of suspicion does something more interesting than simply pronounce guilt. It also tells us why the map ever worked. It worked because forgeries often exploit the natural complexity of real objects. Medieval parchment can survive. Real manuscripts can be broken apart. Authentic historical possibilities can lack direct surviving evidence. Scholars can disagree in good faith over incomplete data. A clever fake enters exactly there, into the gap between what is possible and what is proven. The Vinland Map is almost a textbook example. It used an old support to house a modern fantasy that leaned heavily on a true history of Norse travel. That is why the laboratory had to do more than one job. It had to separate the age of the animal from the age of the ink, the authenticity of the parchment from the authenticity of the line, and the historical plausibility of Vinland from the authenticity of this particular map. So by the time the chemistry had done its work, the question was no longer whether the Vinland Map had scientific problems. It plainly did. The more revealing question was how such a troubled object managed to hold the stage for so long. Part of the answer lies in the science itself, which moves by accumulation, not thunderclap. But part lies elsewhere, in the human love of a beautifully timed surprise, in the prestige of institutions, and in the odd respect one feels for a forgery clever enough to make serious people argue for decades over the age of a line. Once the pigments speak, the map becomes materially easier to judge. What remains harder, and perhaps more interesting, is the person or mindset behind it. The hand that looked at a gap in history and decided not merely to speculate about it, but to manufacture the evidence. That is where the story has to go next, because once suspicion becomes overwhelming, the map stops being a miracle candidate and starts looking like something else entirely. A very intelligent fake. Once the chemistry begins to settle the question, the map changes personality. It is no longer the possible survivor of lost medieval knowledge, nor the uncertain beneficiary of scholarly hope. It becomes something else, and perhaps something even more impressive in its own disturbing way. It becomes a forgery that understood exactly where history was vulnerable. Not a crude fake dashed off by someone who thought old parchment and dramatic handwriting would do the trick, but a document built with an unnerving sense of timing, context, and restraint. If the Vinland Map was forged, as Yale now says there is no reasonable doubt it was, then the person behind it was not merely making a false object, they were designing a historical temptation. That is why the phrase "brilliant forgery" is not really praise, though it can sound like it if one is not careful. It is closer to an acknowledgement of method. A clumsy forgery dies quickly because it asks too much of belief. A successful one enters through a narrow door. It leans on something plausible, something half-known, something that scholars already suspect could be true but cannot yet fully prove. In this case, that something was Norse exploration west of Greenland. By the time the map surfaced in 1957, medieval texts had long preserved the name Vinland, and historians already knew that Norse traditions described voyages to lands beyond Greenland. What archaeology had not yet done was provide the dramatic confirmation that would come in the 1960s at Lonso Meadows. That meant the map arrived in a historical moment when the idea was plausible enough to excite, but not yet so firmly grounded that a forged map would feel redundant. It was a calculated entrance into an open question, and what a careful entrance it was. The map did not emerge alone on fresh paper from some suspicious attic, accompanied by a story involving a dead uncle, a storm, and a locked chest. It came bound with a genuine medieval text known as the Tartar relation, and soon after it was linked physically by matching wormholes to an authentic copy of part of Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Historiale. That association was one of the forgery's greatest strengths. It wrapped the map in borrowed legitimacy. Instead of asking scholars to judge one strange sheet in isolation, it placed the object in a credible medieval neighbourhood. Even people inclined to doubt it had to contend with the fact that its parchment and its codicological setting were not wholly invented. A fake living among genuine companions is always hard to evict. The parchment itself was another masterstroke, whether chosen by the forger directly or acquired already linked to old materials. Radiocarbon dating later showed that the skin was indeed medieval, not modern, which explains part of the map's long life in controversy. If you forge on new parchment, science can embarrass you quickly. If you draw on 15th century calf skin, you force every later investigator to separate the age of the support from the age of the marks on it. That is a far cleverer game. It does not guarantee survival, as the Vinland Map eventually discovered to its sorrow, but it buys time, it complicates headlines, it encourages exactly the sort of lingering debate in which prestige, hope, and institutional caution can keep an artifact afloat for decades. Then there is the design of the map itself, which shows remarkable discipline. A lesser forger might have overplayed the revelation. They might have drawn a western coastline too clearly, made Greenland absurdly modern, or decorated the whole thing with theatrical certainty. The Vinland Map does none of that. It is restrained. It looks modest, manuscript-like, learned, and in some respects derivative of medieval world map tradition. The western landmass is suggestive without being too exact. The rest of the world map is familiar enough to feel old, but the key alteration sits in the very zone where modern viewers most want a surprise. That balance matters. The map does not scream, it murmurs, and in matters of deception, murmuring is often more dangerous. One of the most revealing things about the forgery case is how much it depends on understanding what the maker chose not to do. They did not invent a wholly new medieval cartographic language. They did not redraw the world from scratch. Instead, later historical work by John Paul Floyd showed that the map appears to depend not on Andrea Bianco's original 1436 map, as earlier scholars had supposed, but on a printed facsimile made in 1782, complete with copying mistakes that reappear on the Vinland Map and nowhere else. That is an extraordinary detail because it suggests a mind working not like a medieval compiler, but like a modern counterfeiter with access to printed scholarship. Rather than compose an entire old world from imagination, the maker borrowed a respectable shell and inserted the truly consequential disturbance in the far west. That is not laziness. It is efficiency. And that shell mattered because the rest of the map had to look dull enough for the west to shine. This is one of the subtle arts of forgery. People often imagine a fake as something flamboyant, but the most persuasive historical deceptions are usually strategically boring. They give just enough to reward interest, but not so much that alarm bells start ringing immediately. The Vinland Map's western section made it famous, but the forgery's durability depended on the surrounding ordinariness. Old coastlines, familiar medieval world structure, muted presentation, and an absence of sensational embellishment all helped it. It did not need to be dazzling everywhere. It only needed to be convincing long enough for serious scholars to keep talking. It also helped that the claim at the heart of the deception was not absurd. This may be the single smartest feature of the whole enterprise. The map did not require scholars to believe that medieval Europe had mapped the whole Atlantic in modern detail, or that North America was common knowledge in Florence, or that monks in the 15th century had somehow anticipated satellite geography. It asked for something narrower, and therefore more believable, that some Norse knowledge of lands west of Greenland had survived into a learned map. That is the perfect scale for a forgery. Large enough to matter, small enough to sound possible. Had the map claimed too much, it would have collapsed under its own ambition. Instead, it offered exactly the kind of missing evidence scholars are most tempted to welcome. Not a revolution from nowhere, but a bridge across a gap they already knew was there. The map's first appearance in the modern market also looks more forgery-like the longer one studies it. The British Museum turned it down in 1957, already suspecting a forgery. That early refusal is important because it shows the map did not emerge into a naive world that accepted it uncritically. Some experts found it troubling from the outset, yet it still made its way through the rare book trade, into the hands of Lawrence C., Witten, and eventually into Yale's orbit, where Paul Mellon financed the purchase, and Yale gave the map one of the most powerful things a contested object can receive: institutional shelter. Once a major university has announced a document to the world and linked its reputation to it, the object becomes harder to dismiss quickly. That does not mean the institution acts in bad faith. It means history acquires ballast from prestige, and ballast can keep even a damaged vessel afloat. The provenance trail around Enzo Ferrajoli de Re only deepens the sense that the forgery was operating in an environment where stolen or displaced genuine materials could be recruited into deception. Floyd's work traced the associated Speculum Historiale and Tartar Relation manuscripts back to Zaragoza Cathedral Library before 1957, and pointed out that the old catalogue descriptions did not mention any map. That omission matters. It suggests that the genuine manuscript context may have existed without the map, which then appeared later opportunely attached to it. Add to that Ferrajoli's conviction in connection with thefts from Zaragoza, and the whole story begins to look less like an innocent rediscovery, and more like a classic forgery ecology. Real old material, dubious channels, incomplete records, and just enough documentary fog to let invention slip in beside authenticity. The science, of course, eventually made the forgery case overwhelming. Walter McCrone's work in the 1970s identified anatus, a form of titanium dioxide associated with 20th century manufacture, in the map's lines, and later Yale analysis found that the map is broadly pervaded by a titanium compound used in inks first produced in the 1920s. Yale also reported that the anatus particles resemble those found in a pigment, commercially produced in Norway in 1923. Those findings do not merely suggest that a later hand touched up an old map. They point toward modern manufacture of the writing itself. When a supposedly 15th century document contains a material signature tied to 20th century pigment production, the romance of medieval survival starts losing very badly. Yet what makes the forgery brilliant is that even this did not settle matters quickly. The map had been built to survive partial scientific assault. Because the parchment was medieval, because the object was associated with authentic manuscripts, because the underlying historical scenario was plausible, because the visual design was understated, and because the key claim was so carefully scaled, each damaging result could be resisted for a while by appealing to contamination, exceptional materials, or unresolved uncertainty. A bad forgery dies on first contact with scrutiny. A good one absorbs scrutiny and keeps people divided long enough to become famous. The Vinland Map did precisely that. It spent decades being too suspicious to trust and too seductive to ignore. The overwritten inscription on the reverse may be the most chilling detail of all. Yale's 2021 study found that a Latin note on the back had been altered in modern ink, to make the map appear more convincingly tied to the authentic speculum manuscript. That is not merely sloppiness or later handling, it is narrative engineering. Someone did not just draw a map, someone tried to write the map a medieval biography. That is what elevates this from questionable object to intentional forgery in the stronger sense. The maker, or a later accomplice, understood that authenticity depends not only on materials and style, but on story. A document must seem to have lived the life it claims to have lived. In a way, this is the highest level of forgery craft, not only inventing the artifact, but inventing its past. There is also a psychological elegance to the whole affair. The map flatters its audience. It tells scholars that the past was more complex than the standard account. It tells historians of exploration that there may be a missing cartographic link between Norse voyages and late medieval learned geography. It tells institutions that they may possess an object capable of rewriting a famous story. It tells the public that Columbus is not the whole beginning after all. These are all things people are inclined to listen to. A successful forgery rarely argues against everyone's wishes. It works by aligning itself with just enough of them. The Vinland Map entered a world ready to be intrigued by Vikings in America, ready to revisit discovery narratives, and ready to believe that an old library might still contain one document capable of rearranging the familiar order of things. What we do not have, frustratingly, is certainty about the exact hand behind it. Various suspects and theories have circulated over the years, and Floyd's own work aimed in part to clear one previously suspected figure, Father Josef Fischer. But no consensus culprit has emerged with the same clarity as the consensus against the map itself. That is fitting, in a way. Great deceptions often leave behind a very visible product and a very shadowy maker. The forgery survives as an object even when the forger dissolves into possibility. It is enough, perhaps, to know the type of intelligence involved. This was someone who knew medieval map traditions well enough to imitate them selectively, knew modern scholarship well enough to exploit a live historical question, and had access, directly or indirectly, to genuine old materials through a compromised manuscript environment. And so, the case for a brilliant forgery is not simply the case that the map is false. Yale's current position already states that plainly enough. The stronger and more interesting case is that the map was false in exactly the right way. It was false with patience, false with scholarship, false with an eye for institutional desire and an understanding of how authenticity is performed. It borrowed a real medieval body, clothed itself in familiar cartographic language, inserted one exquisitely provocative Western claim, and trusted that the combination of plausibility and prestige would keep the argument alive. It did. For decades. That is what makes the object both embarrassing and fascinating. It failed as a medieval witness, but it succeeded brilliantly as a modern act of historical deception, and perhaps that is why the forgery remains worth studying even after the verdict has shifted so strongly against it. Because a fake like this does not just expose gullibility, it exposes the places where the historical record is genuinely thin, the points where longing and evidence come too close together, and the kinds of stories we are most eager to rescue from uncertainty. The Vinland Map may not preserve a lost 15th century memory of North America, but it does preserve something else with remarkable clarity. The modern appetite for a document that would make history more surprising without making it wholly implausible. Which is why, even after building the case that the object was crafted to deceive, another question still lingers at the edge of it all. What if the forgery was so effective because it attached itself to something real? Not the map itself, but the larger possibility that some medieval knowledge of Western lands once did survive farther than we can now prove. By the time the case against the Vinland Map itself becomes strong, a quieter and more interesting possibility is still left standing in the background. Not that this particular document is genuine. The scientific evidence now weighs far too heavily against that. But that the forger, if there was one, chose this subject so carefully because it rested on a real historical weakness in the record. There really was Western knowledge in the medieval North. There really were Norse voyages to North America around the year 1000. There really were texts and traditions that preserved memory of lands beyond Greenland. And there are a few scattered signs that some of that knowledge may have circulated farther and lasted longer than older textbook narratives once allowed. That is the strongest version of the case for lost knowledge. It does not rescue the map. It explains why the map was such an effective temptation in the first place. The first part of that case is now firm enough to say without nervousness. Norse contact with North America before Columbus is not a literary fantasy and not a patriotic embellishment. It is an archaeological fact. Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland is widely accepted as the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside Greenland, and the evidence shows Norse presence there around the early 11th century. The sagas had long spoken of Leif Erikson, Vinland, timber and western voyages, but for a long time those texts floated in a space between history and heroic memory. The excavation of the site changed that balance. What had once looked to some like only story now had buildings, artifacts, ironworking and datable wood behind it. That matters because once one part of an old tradition is confirmed, historians become more alert to the possibility that other fragments of that tradition may also preserve something real, even if indirectly and imperfectly. The second part is that Vinland was not only remembered inside Icelandic saga literature. Britannica notes that the tales of the North American land of wine entered continental European literature almost certainly by 1075 through Adam of Bremen's history of the Archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen. Adam says he learned of Vinland from King Sweden II of Denmark, and he describes it as an island where vines grow wild. That is a very important point. It means that roughly 75 years after the likely Norse voyages, some report of Western land had already crossed from Scandinavian or Greenlandic knowledge into a Latin-learned text on the continent. Not a map yet, not a full geographic revolution, but a signal. Vinland was capable of traveller's information. It did not remain sealed forever inside one remote colony. And once you admit that, the whole question becomes less dramatic and more historically realistic. Lost knowledge does not have to mean a hidden archive or a suppressed truth carefully locked away by authorities in robes. More often it means thin transmission. A report enters one text and not another. A name survives, but its exact location blurs. A voyage is remembered, but only in fragments. The centre of Europe hears of something unusual at the northern edge, but the report never becomes important enough to redraw the common mental map of the world. This is normal. Medieval knowledge did not move evenly. It moved through traders, churchmen, royal courts, manuscript copying, oral retelling, and all the little accidents of preservation and neglect that decide what later centuries get to inherit. Adam of Bremen's mention of Vinland is therefore small, but it is exactly the sort of small thing that matters in historical transmission. It proves that some Western knowledge could leak outward. Then there are the Icelandic annals, which matter because they suggest that Western knowledge did not die immediately after the first famous voyages. One annal entry records that in 1121 Bishop Eric of Greenland went to seek, or perhaps visit, Vinland. Another later tradition notes that in 1347 a ship came to Iceland after being blown off course, while returning from Markland to Greenland with a cargo of timber. These entries are brief, frustrating and far from complete, but they are exactly the kind of evidence historians are often left with when trying to reconstruct activity on the far edge of the medieval world. They imply that the Western lands were not simply discovered once and then swallowed by silence. At minimum, Vinland and Markland still existed as meaningful destinations or remembered places in North Atlantic knowledge well after the original expeditions. That is not enough to prove widespread European awareness, but it is enough to support the idea of a longer northern memory than older simplified narratives used to allow. The Markland evidence is especially interesting because it shifts the story from wonder to routine, and routine is often where lost knowledge survives best. If the 1347 reference really does mean that a Greenland-bound ship had been in Markland gathering timber, then Western Land was not merely a legendary place from saga memory, it was part of a practical resource world. Greenlanders needed wood, Markland offered wood. A voyage for timber is much less glamorous than a heroic discovery, but historically it can be much more believable as a repeated pattern. People revisit useful places. They may not write epics about every cargo run, but they remember where to go. That is how working knowledge persists at the edges of formal geography, not as grand revelation, but as habit. And habits can survive in communities even when they leave only faint written traces. Archaeology supports that practical picture too. Parks Canada notes that Lonceau Meadows likely served as a base for further exploration and resource gathering, and the sagas describe the Norse returning to Greenland with lumber and other useful goods. More importantly, butternuts and butternut wood found at the site indicate travel south of Newfoundland, since those trees do not grow there. Smithsonian summarised the point clearly when reporting the 1021 dating study. Butternuts and butternut tree fragments at the site suggest the Norse travelled south of Newfoundland, though how far remains uncertain. This matters for the case for lost knowledge because it reminds us that the Norse Western world was probably not one single point on a map. It was a set of routes, camps and resource zones. A culture that moved through those places could preserve names and directional knowledge, even if later manuscript evidence remained sparse. The name Markland then becomes a quiet clue, with a surprisingly long afterlife. In 2021, Paolo Chiesa published work on a 14th century text by the Milanese friar Galvano Fiamma that contains a reference to a land called Markalada, west of Greenland. Chiesa argues that this can be recognised as the Markland known from Icelandic sources, and that it is the first mention of the American continent in the Mediterranean region, probably derived from oral reports heard in Genoa. That claim should be handled carefully. It does not prove that southern Europe had a working map of North America before Columbus. It does not prove a chain of exact transmission, but it is a serious scholarly finding, and it suggests something important. Stories of lands beyond Greenland may have travelled farther south and farther into European discourse than historians once believed. That is exactly the kind of partial circulation that a later forger might notice and exploit. This is where the phrase lost knowledge needs to be used responsibly. The strongest historical version does not say that medieval Europe secretly knew the Americas in any broad or modern sense. That would go too far. The more plausible version is narrower. Some Norse and Greenlandic communities had real knowledge of lands west of Greenland. Some of that knowledge entered written traditions in Iceland. Some of it reached continental Europe through Adam of Bremen by the late 11th century. Small traces suggest Western lands remained meaningful in North Atlantic memory into the 12th and 14th centuries. A newly identified text from 14th century Italy may indicate that reports of Markland circulated in Mediterranean maritime environments as well. None of this adds up to a hidden pre-Columbian Europe with a complete Atlantic map in a drawer, but it does add up to something messier and more believable, a patchy survival of Western knowledge that was never central enough to endure cleanly. And once you picture that, the broader historical landscape starts to make more sense. Medieval Europe was not equally informed in all directions. Northern knowledge often remained northern for a long time. Classical geographical authorities still shaped how scholars imagined the world. New reports entered slowly and unevenly. A seafaring culture at the far edge of the North Atlantic might know where to sail for timber, but that did not mean university masters in Paris or map compilers in Central Europe were instantly updating their view of the globe. Knowledge can exist locally and fail to scale. It can be true, useful, and yet still fade from the main historical narrative because the institutions that preserve and replicate information do not treat it as central. Lost knowledge is often not suppressed knowledge at all. It is knowledge that never got enough copying, enough prestige, or enough practical reinforcement to survive in stable form. There is also the matter of Greenland itself. For several centuries it functioned as a real Norse colony, but a marginal one, dependent on difficult trade and vulnerable to changing conditions. If Western land knowledge was largely housed there, then its survival was always precarious. When a frontier weakens, its information can weaken with it. That is true in many periods of history. Routes become uncertain. Contacts break, communities shrink, and memories narrow. By the time later Europeans began serious Atlantic exploration from Iberia, the Greenlandic world that had once faced west had already lost much of its strength. So the absence of a strong, continuous cartographic tradition linking Vinland to the 15th century is not surprising. The surprising thing would be if such fragile frontier knowledge had survived perfectly. In that sense, a broken record is exactly what we should expect. This is one reason the Vinland Map debate lasted so long, even after objections mounted. The map itself may be false, but the historical hole it claimed to fill is real. There really is a gap between confirmed Norse contact around the year 1000 and the much later European rediscovery of the Western Atlantic as a central arena of expansion. There really are enough textual crumbs to suspect that some awareness persisted. There really are reasons to think certain names and routes remained alive, at least in northern circles, and perhaps drifted farther than once believed. A forged document lodged in that gap can feel persuasive, because it is parasitic on an actual uncertainty. It does not invent the possibility of lost knowledge, it counterfeits the missing proof of it. There is another layer here, and it is easy to overlook because maps attract so much attention. Lost knowledge does not have to survive in maps to be historically important. It can survive in place names, voyage habits, bishops' errands, timber runs, oral tradition, or one-line annal notices that later generations almost miss. Historians tend to prize maps because they are visually satisfying and seem to summarize knowledge in one object. But many societies carry working knowledge without ever stabilizing it in that form. The Norse westward world may have been partly like that. It may have lived more in sailing communities than in formal schools of cartography. If so, then the scarcity of neat map evidence tells us less about whether the knowledge existed than about how and where it was stored. That possibility does not prove any one disputed artifact. It simply widens the kinds of evidence we allow into the room. At the same time, caution remains necessary. The case for lost knowledge is strongest when it stays modest. The farther it stretches, the weaker it becomes. Adam of Bremen shows continental awareness of Vinland by 1075, but only in a brief report. The annals imply continued northern awareness, but they do not map anything. Galvano Fiamma's Markalada is suggestive and important, but it is still one text and still subject to interpretation about how exactly the information reached him. Archaeology confirms Norse presence and movement, but archaeology does not tell us how many clerics, mapmakers or merchants elsewhere in Europe understood what that presence meant geographically. So the honest historian ends up with an answer that is both more cautious and more intriguing than a simple yes or no. Some knowledge survived, some of it travelled, much of it did not settle into durable common knowledge, and that is precisely the kind of half-preserved reality that later generations can both underestimate and over-imagine. In that sense, the case for lost knowledge is not really a case for the Vinland Map at all. It is a case for historical humility. It reminds us that what later ages treat as official discovery is often only the moment when one stream of knowledge becomes dominant enough to leave a larger mark on institutions, maps, and memory. Long before that, smaller streams may already have been flowing. The Norse knew Western lands existed. Greenlanders may have continued using some of them. A bishop may have gone looking for Vinland in 1121. A ship may have returned from Markland with timber in 1347. A Milanese friar may have heard enough in Genoa to write Markalada into a chronicle around 1340. None of this overturns the later age of exploration, but it does make the older world look less sealed, less simple, and more connected by stray threads than the cleanest versions of history once allowed. And perhaps that is why this part of the story remains so compelling, even after the map itself has lost most of its claim to authenticity. The forgery case tells us how cleverly history can be manipulated. The lost knowledge case tells us why the manipulation worked. It worked because there was something real underneath it, a broken chain of Western memory, too strong to dismiss completely and too weak to reconstruct with confidence. That is the kind of setting in which historical judgments keep changing, because new methods, new texts, and new interpretations can shift the balance without ever delivering total certainty. Which is why, once we leave the map and the Norse behind for a moment, the larger lesson comes into view. History changes its mind not only because people make mistakes, but because the evidence itself survives unevenly, arrives late, and keeps forcing us to decide how much uncertainty we are willing to live with. And this, perhaps, is the part of the story that unsettles people most. Not the forged map, not the disputed coastline, not even the thought that a document can sit in a great library for decades, while serious scholars disagree over what it is. The deeper discomfort is that history itself seems to move. It shifts, it revises, it changes its mind. One decade a thing is hailed as a breakthrough, another decade it is treated as doubtful, and later still it may be discarded, revived, reframed, or understood in a way no earlier generation quite managed. To many people that can feel like weakness, as though the past ought to be fixed, and historians ought simply to fetch it neatly from storage. But that has never really been how history works. Historiography, as Britannica puts it, is not just the collecting of old facts. It is the writing of history through the critical examination of sources, the selection of details from authentic materials, and their synthesis into narratives that can stand critical scrutiny. In other words, history is not a pile of facts waiting politely in a cupboard. It is a continual effort to interpret incomplete remains from the past. That distinction matters enormously. The past itself does not change. What happened, happened. The Norse either reached Western lands around the year 1000 or they did not. The Vinland Map was either drawn in the 15th century or it was not. But our access to the past is never direct. We approach it through manuscripts, artifacts, annals, oral traditions, damaged objects, translated texts, excavation reports, chemical analyses, and all the other imperfect things that manage somehow to survive us. Those remains do not explain themselves. They have to be interpreted, compared, challenged, and set in relation to other evidence. The American Historical Association standards put it quite plainly. Historians should report findings as accurately as possible, and should not omit evidence that runs counter to their interpretation. That is not a description of certainty. It is a description of disciplined argument under conditions of incompleteness. The Vinland Map is almost an ideal lesson in why history changes its mind, because the object sat at the intersection of several kinds of evidence that did not all mature at the same speed. The first scholars who assessed it did not have access to every technique later generations would use. They could study handwriting, style, language, codicological context, and visual comparison, but they did not yet have the full range of analytical chemistry that would later expose the ink more convincingly. Then came mid- and late 20th century microscopy, then radiocarbon dating of the parchment, then Raman spectroscopy, then broader elemental mapping and electron microscopy. Yale's 2021 campaign was able to examine the map more thoroughly than earlier researchers, and it concluded that the map is awash in 20th century ink, with titanium compounds consistent with modern manufacture and altered writing on the reverse done in the same kind of modern ink. History did not change its mind here because historians became whimsical. It changed because the available evidence changed in quality, scale, and force. That happens more often than people realise. Sometimes new evidence appears because the ground gives something up. Lonso Meadows is the obvious example in this story. Before the site was excavated, the Vinland sagas lived in a more uncertain category for many readers. They were interesting, yes, but they could still be treated as literary tradition rather than historical witness. Archaeology changed that balance. Parks Canada describes the sagas as accounts, first told orally and later written down, and the remains at Lanso Meadows gave those narratives a confirmed Norse foothold in North America. That did not prove every line of every saga, but it shifted the background assumptions of the whole discussion. Suddenly, a Norse Western voyage was not merely plausible, it was materially grounded. Once that changed, every related question had to be reconsidered in a new light. And notice how subtle that change is. New evidence rarely settles every question at once. It more often rearranges which questions seem reasonable. The discovery of Lanso Meadows did not prove the Vinland Map genuine. It simply made the map's central claim less impossible in principle. That is a very different thing. One of the reasons historical debate can feel so unstable to outsiders is that conclusions are often conditional. A finding does not say, all mysteries solved, everyone go home. It says, this part is firmer now, therefore the neighbouring problems must be re-evaluated. Knowledge spreads outward in ripples. A confirmed site in Newfoundland affects how scholars read 11th century texts, how they assess later medieval references, how they interpret the ambitions of a possible forger, and how they think about the limits of European awareness before Columbus. History changes its mind not in one dramatic pivot, but by thousands of these quieter adjustments. There is another reason historical judgment keeps shifting, and it is less about new evidence than about new questions. Every generation asks the past something slightly different. An earlier historian may have focused on kings, voyages, and official discovery. A later historian may ask about trade networks, manuscript circulation, indigenous presence, environmental pressures, or the social life of objects. The past has not changed, but the angle of approach has. Britannica's overview of historiography notes that there are many branches of history today, each with its own kinds of evidence and conventions of interpretation. That diversity is not a defect. It is a sign that the past can be investigated from more than one direction. In the Vinland story, older generations may have asked, did Europeans discover America before Columbus? A later generation is more likely to ask, which Europeans? Known by whom? Recorded where? Compared with indigenous knowledge. Through what texts, routes and institutions did that information travel or fail to travel? Those are better questions, and better questions often make old answers look suspiciously blunt. This is also why apparently settled history can become unsettled without anyone behaving irresponsibly. Sometimes an old answer was simply built for a narrower question. Columbus as the discoverer of America is a perfect example of that. It was always a deeply compressed and misleading formula, but it survived for so long because it served a symbolic story more than an analytical one. Once historians widened the frame to include Norse voyages, indigenous continuity, transatlantic contact zones, and the politics of memory, the older phrase began to crack. The change did not occur because fact suddenly became fashionable. It occurred because the old narrative was doing an increasingly poor job of describing the evidence. In that sense, when history changes its mind, it is often not abandoning truth, but getting closer to it by refusing a simpler version that once seemed adequate. Then there is the matter of survival, which may be the single most underappreciated force in all historical revision. The archive is not a balanced sample of what once existed. It is a wreckage field. Some things survive because they were copied often, some because they were stored in dry conditions, some because institutions valued them. Others vanish through war, damp, neglect, conquest, theft, rebinding, accidental fire, bureaucratic indifference, or the timeless human gift for misplacing what matters. The Vinland Map itself became famous partly because it appeared to answer a real gap. If Norse voyages happened, why is the surviving cartographic record so thin? But thin records are normal. Adam of Bremen's brief mention of Vinland, the saga tradition preserved later in Icelandic manuscripts, and the scattered annal references to Vinland or Markland all suggest the survival of Western knowledge in fragments rather than in one smooth chain. History changes its mind partly because new survivals keep turning up, and partly because historians become better at respecting how much may once have existed without surviving neatly. That respect for fragility can be uncomfortable because it introduces uncertainty where people often want ceremony. Public culture likes beginnings, firsts, and anniversaries. It likes a name attached to a date. Historians, on the other hand, become increasingly suspicious of tidy symbolic thresholds the longer they work. They know that first usually depends on what exactly you are measuring. First human presence, first European landfall, first surviving written mention, first mapped depiction, first sustained colonial entanglement, first generally accepted proof. Each of those can produce a different answer, all technically defensible in context. This is why so many historical disputes look, from a distance, like people arguing over semantics. Often they are arguing over categories, and categories shape what counts as evidence. Change the category, and the story shifts with it. The Vinland Map also shows how institutions influence when and how history changes its mind. A disputed object in a private drawer might be quietly forgotten. A disputed object attached to Yale becomes something else. It gathers scholarship, reputational stakes, public attention, and defensive caution. When Yale announced in 2021 that its new analysis demonstrated the map was a fake, the statement mattered precisely because institutions help stabilize historical judgment in public life. At the same time, institutions can delay revision by giving suspect objects prestige and shelter. This is not sinister in every case, it is simply human. Museums, libraries, universities, publishers, and school systems all help determine which interpretations become common knowledge and which remain specialist debate. History changes its mind not only in seminar rooms but in catalogues, exhibits, documentaries, and revised labels. There is too the role of technology, which should not be underestimated. We tend to imagine historical method as dusty and textual, but modern history is also profoundly technical. Dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, pigment analysis, multispectral imaging, isotopic study, DNA work, satellite archaeology, and digital collation have all changed what historians and archaeologists can know. The 1021 date for Norse presence in Newfoundland came from tree ring work tied to a known atmospheric radiocarbon spike. The fake status of the Vinland Map became much harder to resist once modern chemical analysis mapped its ink comprehensively. This means that sometimes history changes its mind for the same reason medicine or astronomy does. The instruments get better. The past does not become more polite under analysis, but it does become harder to bluff. Of course, not every revision is a triumph. Sometimes history changes its mind because people are persuaded too quickly by prestige, novelty, ideology, or the appeal of a dramatic upset. The Vinland Map's early reception contained some of that as well. A document that appeared to challenge Columbus before the archaeology of Lonceau Meadows had fully reframed North America was always going to attract enthusiasm. Scholars are trained skeptics, but they are not machines. They can be impressed. They can be ambitious. They can also be more willing to tolerate ambiguity when an object promises to answer a famous question. This is one reason professional standards matter so much. The AHA's insistence that historians not omit counter-evidence is not some dull ethical add-on. It is a practical defense against our natural tendency to fall in love with a good story. Yet, it would be wrong to say that historical revision is merely a matter of correction, as though the discipline lurches from one mistake to the next. Often later, historians do not simply replace an old answer with a new one. They produce a more layered one. Consider Vinland itself. The older simplified story might have been, Columbus discovered the New World. A later corrective might have said, no, Leif Erikson got there first. But even that is too tidy if left alone. A fuller account now has to include indigenous peoples already living across the Americas, Norse voyages from Greenland, the difference between contact and sustained hemispheric transformation, the uneven survival of medieval Western knowledge, and the modern politics of commemoration. The newer account is not just the opposite of the old one. It is more crowded, more conditional, and more difficult to fit on a commemorative statue. That is usually a sign of improvement. There is also something almost healthy in the fact that history changes its mind publicly. In many fields, the process of revision is hidden from non-specialists. In history, it often happens in full view, because the subject concerns identities, origins, grievances, and memory. People notice when schoolbooks change. They notice when museums relabel objects. They notice when old heroes acquire shadows, or when forgotten actors re-enter the story. That visibility can make revision look chaotic, but it is also a sign that the discipline is alive. A dead history would never change its mind because it would no longer be asking questions. A living one keeps testing its own narratives against new evidence, new methods, and new moral seriousness about who was left out the first time. And perhaps that is why the Vinland Map remains useful, even after the scientific verdict has turned so sharply against it. It shows both sides of revision at once. It shows how history can be misled by a plausible and well-timed fake. But it also shows how history eventually corrects itself, not through one magician's reveal, but through cumulative scrutiny. The object passed through visual study, manuscript comparison, radiocarbon dating, microscopy, and chemical mapping before the balance finally tipped hard enough for Yale to say there was no reasonable doubt it was a modern forgery. That long process can look messy from the outside. It is messy. But messiness is often what honesty looks like when certainty has not yet been earned. So when history changes its mind, it is not always because the old historians were foolish or the new historians are fashionable. Sometimes it changes because a new site is excavated. Sometimes because a manuscript is rediscovered. Sometimes because an old text is read more carefully. Sometimes because a pigment particle under a microscope refuses to stay in the century it was assigned. Sometimes because society finally asks a question it should have asked long ago. And sometimes because the past itself, through its broken and stubborn remains, keeps resisting the neatness we try to impose on it. Which leaves us with one final kind of question, not about whether the Vinland Map is authentic, and not even about whether some Western knowledge once survived longer than we can now document, but about why this object continues to hold us at all, what it asks of our imagination, our caution, and our need for the past to tell us who we are. By the end of this long, quiet puzzle, the Vinland Map asks something more difficult of us than a simple verdict. On one level, the modern scholarly position is now fairly clear. Yale's 2021 analysis concluded that the map's lines and text are pervaded by a titanium compound associated with inks first produced in the 1920s, and Yale's curator of early books and manuscripts said plainly, the Vinland Map is a fake, and that there was no reasonable doubt left. The same analysis also found evidence that writing on the reverse had been altered in modern ink to make the map appear more convincingly bound to an authentic medieval manuscript. At the same time, the broader historical background that made the map so tempting never disappeared. Norse expeditions really did sail from Greenland to North America, and Alonso Meadows remains the first known evidence of European presence in the Americas, with a small Norse encampment built there more than 1,000 years ago. So the object fails, but the larger story around it does not. That is why the map still matters. It is false in one sense, but still revealing in several others. What it asks of us first, I think, is restraint. We are not naturally patient with the past. We like revelations. We like a single object that rearranges everything at once. We like a hidden document, a buried city, a dramatic first, a secret route, a brilliant correction to a boring textbook. There is something deeply satisfying about the fantasy that history can be overturned by one extraordinary find, especially if that find also makes the world feel older, stranger, and more interconnected than we had realised. The Vinland Map offered exactly that kind of satisfaction. It seemed to promise not merely a disputed artifact, but a rebuke to neat chronology. It implied that the edge of the medieval world might have been wider than historians had allowed, and that somewhere in a manuscript tradition there survived a memory of Western lands no one was supposed to have mapped so early. Even now, after the scientific verdict has hardened, one can still feel the shape of that temptation. The map asks whether we can love historical surprise without surrendering to it too quickly. It also asks whether we can hold two truths in our minds at once, without forcing them to become one. The first truth is that the map itself is not what it claimed to be. The second is that the historical possibility it exploited was never ridiculous. Vinland was not invented in the 20th century. Britannica notes that the tales of the North American land of wine entered continental European literature by about 1075 through Adam of Bremen, who wrote about Vinland on the authority of King Svein II of Denmark. Parks Canada, meanwhile, presents the sagas as preserving oral traditions of Western voyages that were later written down, and it explicitly links those traditions to the North American site at Lonso Meadows. In other words, a real Norse Western memory existed, and some of it did travel beyond Greenland and Iceland into wider medieval discourse. The map was persuasive because it attached itself to that truth. It did not create the possibility of lost knowledge from nothing. It counterfeited a missing witness to something already plausible. That distinction matters far beyond this one artifact. History is full of false documents built around real absences. The archive has gaps, and some of those gaps are genuine. People know this instinctively. We know that records are lost, frontiers forget, manuscripts are broken apart, and remote communities often preserve knowledge that never becomes central enough to survive in polished institutional form. So when a document appears to fill one of those gaps elegantly, we are vulnerable. Not because we are foolish, but because the whole itself is real. The Vinland Map asks whether we can tell the difference between this story could have left thin traces, and therefore this specific object must be one of them. That is a much harder skill than it sounds. It requires not only imagination, but discipline. It requires being willing to say that a broad historical possibility may be sound while the object claiming to prove it may still be false. The map also asks something about trust, and perhaps even about the kind of trust we place in institutions. Yale's own account of the 2021 study notes that the university helped create the map's public sensation in 1965 when it announced the document's existence and published a scholarly book about it. Later, Yale's conservators and scientists were the ones who delivered the strongest modern case against it. There is something almost admirable in that arc. The same institution that gave the object prestige also helped dismantle its authority when better evidence and better tools made that possible. But there is also a caution in it. Libraries, museums, universities and archives do not simply store the past. They shape how the public encounters it. Their confidence can make an object seem more settled than it is, and their self-correction can arrive slowly because the cost of being wrong is never trivial. The Vinland Map asks us to respect institutions without treating them as infallible, and to see scholarly correction not as humiliation, but as one of the obligations of stewardship. It asks something too about the nature of evidence itself. We often speak as if evidence were one thing, when in fact it comes in layers that do not always agree politely. The Vinland Map sat on medieval parchment. It was physically associated with authentic medieval manuscript materials. Yet Yale's later work found that the ink did not behave like 15th century iron gall ink, and instead contained titanium compounds and anatars consistent with modern manufacture. The reverse side inscription showed signs of deliberate modern alteration. So what do you do when the skin is old, the story is plausible, the setting is partly genuine, but the line itself is lying? The answer is that you learn to separate the object into components and listen to each of them individually. The map asks us to stop thinking of authenticity as a single stamp and start thinking of it as a conversation between support, ink, text, context, and intent. That may sound technical, but it is really a philosophical lesson in disguise. The past is often composite. A thing can be partly ancient and partly false at the same time. Another thing the map asks of us is humility about survival. We are used to speaking of the historical record as though it were a large, somewhat dusty file cabinet. In truth, it is more like a coastline after a wreck, with fragments washing in unevenly. The American Historical Association standards emphasize that historical scholarship depends on the collection and preservation of documents, artifacts, and other source materials, and that historians should not misrepresent their sources. That sounds obvious, but embedded in it is a sober recognition. History is constrained by what survives and by how honestly we handle it. The Vinland story is a perfect reminder. A brief continental mention in Adam of Brienne survives. The sagas survive in later written forms of earlier oral traditions. A Norse encampment survives in Newfoundland. The Greenland colonies do not survive as living communities. Untold other pieces vanished somewhere between weather, neglect, silence, and time. The map asks whether we are capable of living with that fragmentariness without either inflating it into fantasy or shrinking it into cynicism. And then there is the matter of firsts, those charming little historical traps we keep stepping into. We love firsts because they are tidy. First discoverer, first map, first crossing, first proof. They make for excellent plaques and unbearable arguments. But the Vinland Map sits right in the middle of a story where first is almost useless unless you explain what you mean. Indigenous peoples were in the Americas for millennia before any Norse voyage. Norse expeditions reached North America centuries before Columbus. Adam of Brienne mentioned Vinland in continental Europe by about 1075. Lonso Meadows gives us the first known archaeological evidence of European presence in the Americas. Columbus's voyages, later than all of that, nevertheless triggered sustained and transformative entanglements on a scale the Norse expeditions did not. Which of these is the first that matters most depends entirely on the question being asked. The map asks whether we can let go of the fantasy that one date and one person should carry the full burden of a continent's encounter with Europe. It asks us too whether we understand how real historical work proceeds. People often imagine scholarship as a sequence of certainties. First a theory, then a proof, then a conclusion, all arranged like stones across a stream. But the HA's standards emphasize documentation, openness about evidence, and a readiness to follow sound method and analysis wherever they lead. That is a much less theatrical process. It means that sometimes a document remains under suspicion for decades because the methods available at one stage are suggestive but not definitive. It means that new tools, like the ones Yale used in 2021 to map the distribution of titanium across the whole document, can change the confidence of the conclusion even if the basic doubts were older. It means that honest scholarship often looks slow from the outside. The Vinland Map asks whether we can see slowness not as weakness, but as care. Historians and conservators did not fail because the argument took a long time. In an important sense, the long argument was the discipline doing its job. There is also a more personal question hidden in the whole affair. Why do maps affect us so strongly in the first place? A disputed chronicle entry can be interesting. A forged letter can be sensational. But a map has a peculiar authority because it lets us look at knowledge. It turns rumour into line, memory into shape, and possibility into geography. To see Vinlanda Insula placed in the Western Ocean was to feel that a missing thought had become visible. That is why the forgery worked so well. It did not merely assert, it displayed. It let viewers imagine the moment when medieval Europe almost, but not quite, knew more than it should have. Even now, after the verdict, the image retains some of that force. The map asks whether we are willing to admit how much of historical persuasion is visual, and how quickly a line on parchment can outrun a paragraph of caution. At the same time, the map asks us not to confuse mystery with permission. One of the most seductive habits in popular history is the leap from uncertainty to invention. We do not know everything, therefore perhaps everything is possible. But uncertainty is not a blank check. It is a specific condition that must be handled specifically. In the Vinland case, there really are unresolved areas around how widely Norse-Western knowledge circulated, how long certain place names remained active, and how much of that information entered wider European mental worlds before Columbus. The existence of those open questions is precisely why the map was so tempting. But open questions are not evidence for any answer we find emotionally satisfying. The map asks whether we can preserve wonder without making wonder itself the standard of proof. I think it also asks something gentler, and perhaps more human, about our relationship to the people who actually lived this history. It is easy to let a famous forgery overshadow the real individuals at the edge of the story. Greenlanders who needed timber badly enough to sail farther west, sailors who found unfamiliar coasts, indigenous communities who encountered these strangers on lands they already knew intimately, scribes who preserved fragments of memory, and later readers who carried names like Vinland forward without fully understanding what they held. Parks Canada's saga materials still preserve that older practical world of camp, timber, salmon, grapes, return voyages, and conflict. Yale's test can expose a false map, but they cannot erase the reality that medieval people did move across these northern waters and leave just enough trace to trouble later narratives. The map asks us not to let the drama of deception consume the quieter dignity of the real past that made the deception believable. And finally, perhaps, the Vinland Map asks us what we want the past to do for us. Do we want it to reassure us with tidy beginnings and endings? Do we want it to astonish us with secret knowledge? Do we want it to deliver one definitive artifact that settles old arguments forever? Or can we tolerate a harder gift, a past that stays partly open, partly damaged, and partly resistant to the neat story? The map is false, yes, but the question it pressed on was real. How much did medieval people know beyond the official line of later history? More than some once thought, and less than this document pretended to prove. That in-between answer is not as dramatic as a miracle map, but it may be more faithful to the way human knowledge usually works. It expands unevenly. It survives patchily. It fades. It returns. It is carried by people at the edges long before it is stamped by institutions at the centre. So when we roll this story back up and set the parchment aside, what remains is not only the embarrassment of a forgery or the satisfaction of a solved case. What remains is a certain posture of mind. Be curious, but not gullible. Be open to revision, but not addicted to sensational correction. Respect the archive, but never mistake it for completeness. Let science speak when it can. Let texts whisper when they must. And remember that the past is full of things once known, half-known, misknown, and lost. The Vinland Map may not tell us that medieval Europe had a reliable map of North America before Columbus, but it does tell us that our longing for such a thing is powerful, and that somewhere between skepticism and wonder is where the best historical thinking usually lives. And if there is a final comfort in that, it may be this. The world is still large enough that even a false map can teach us something true about how we search for it.